Hey you! Yes, you're curled up with your phone right now, probably with the lights already dim and a pillow pulled just a little closer. Welcome back. Or if tonight is your very first time here, well, you chose the perfect story to start with. Because tonight we are not talking about a queen who wanted power. We're not talking about a woman who dreamed of a crown. We're talking about a girl who wanted nothing more than to feel the wind on her face race her horse through the Bavarian hills and be left beautifully, wonderfully alone. And yet history had other plans. Here is what I want you to imagine for just a moment. A young emperor, the most powerful man in all of Europe, walks into a room prepared to meet the woman his mother has chosen for him to marry. He sees her, and then he looks slightly to the left at her younger sister standing quietly in the corner, in a black mourning dress with wild, dark hair and eyes that looked like they belonged somewhere far, far away from any palace. He forgets everything his mother told him. He forgets the plan entirely. He says quietly to the people around him, "If I cannot marry her, I will not marry at all." That girl in the corner was 15 years old. Her name was Elizabeth, but the whole world would come to know her as Sisi. And here is the strange and haunting truth about her life. The throne she never asked for would give her everything the world envies, and quietly take from her nearly everything she loved. Before we go any further into tonight's story, if the way I tell stories moves something in you, if you find yourself drifting deeper into the night alongside me, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe, not because you have to, but because when you do, it tells me that what I am building here actually matters to someone. And if you want to make my night, drop a comment below. Tell me where in the world you're watching this from right now. Are you in bed on a couch? Maybe somewhere you should not still be awake. I genuinely love knowing. Now go ahead and dim those lights just a touch lower. Let the fan run, or put on something soft in the background, and let us go back all the way back to a castle by the lake in Bavaria in the year 1837, Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1837. In a grand but slightly chaotic palace on Ludwigstrasse in Munich, a baby girl was born into the House of Wittelsbach, one of the oldest royal dynasties in all of Europe. Her full name formerly was Elisabeth Amalie Eugenie, but no one called her that. To her father, to her brothers, to the 7 siblings who ran wild with her through the fields of summer, she was simply Sisi. And Sisi's childhood was nothing like what you might imagine for a girl of royal blood. Her father, Duke Maximilian Joseph in Bavaria, was a man who was almost allergic to responsibility. He loved circuses. He genuinely loved circuses, not as a patron, not from a royal box, but the kind of love where he would wander off to watch acrobats and clowns in the middle of his obligations and simply not come back for a while. He travelled the Bavarian countryside on a whim, played the zither, a stringed folk instrument, wrote poetry, and by most accounts preferred the company of ordinary people over the stiff-collared aristocracy he was technically a part of. He was in the most charming sense of the word a bit of a disaster, and Sisi adored him. Her mother, Princess Ludovica, was more grounded, the daughter of a Bavarian king, the sister of women who had married into some of Europe's greatest thrones. But Ludovica had been pushed into her own marriage without love. She once wrote in her diary that her life far from the great courts of Europe felt countrified, a polite word for small and overlooked, and a little lonely. So Sisi grew up in a household held together by 2 people who were genuinely mismatched, a father who chased joy wherever it ran, and a mother who had quietly made peace with a life she had not chosen. And maybe, just maybe, watching that from a young age left a mark on Sisi that no one quite understood until much later. But the childhood itself, the childhood was by all accounts something close to magical. The family split their time between Munich in winter and a summer home called Possenhofen Castle, a pale yellow castle sitting right on the edge of Lake Starnberg, surrounded by forest with the Alps glowing faintly in the distance on clear days. There were no rigid schedules at Possenhofen, no court etiquette to memorize, no lines to stand in, no ceremonial dresses to wear. Sisi and her siblings swam in the lake in summer-climbed trees, chased each other through the meadows and rode horses with a kind of reckless freedom that was genuinely unusual for children of their rank. She skipped her formal lessons regularly and unapologetically to go riding instead. She had a gift with animals that people found almost uncanny. She could calm a nervous horse with her voice alone. She was fearless on horseback in a way that made even experienced riders stop and watch, and she read, deeply hungrily on her own terms, not the approved texts of aristocratic education, but poetry the raw, searching kind. Heine, Schiller, writers who asked uncomfortable questions about freedom and the soul. By the time she was a teenager, Sisi was not the polished, obedient daughter of a minor royal house. She was something else entirely, a free spirit dressed in the clothes of a duchess, and freedom, as she would learn, is the one thing that palaces are not designed to protect. Now here is where the story takes a turn, and it is the kind of turn that makes you realize how thin the line is between an ordinary life and a completely extraordinary one. In 1853, Sisi's mother Ludovica received an invitation. Her sister, not her sister in the gentle sisterly sense, but her sister Sophie, who had married up into the Habsburg dynasty and become one of the most powerful women in Austria, wanted to arrange a meeting. Sophie's son, the young emperor Franz Joseph, needed a wife, and Sophie, who was nothing if not strategic, wanted to keep things in the family. So she'd decided Franz Joseph would marry Helene, Sisi's older sister. Quiet, pious, obedient Helene, everything a Habsburg empress was supposed to be. The invitation was to travel to the resort town of Bad Ischl in Upper Austria, where the young emperor would formally meet his future bride. Sisi came along for the ride, literally. She was not the point of the trip. She was 16, no 15, she had just turned 15, and she was invited the way you invite a younger sibling to tag along, for company, for the journey. She was also incidentally in something of a low mood that summer, mourning the recent death of a young count she'd been fond of. Her mother thought the trip would cheer her up, and so the coaches set off from Munich. There were complications from the start, because of course there were. Ludovica suffered from severe headaches, what we might today call migraines, and she had to stop the journey partway through to recover. The coaches got separated in the confusion, and the coach carrying the family's formal gala dresses, the carefully chosen appropriate look, "We are meeting an emperor" outfit, simply never arrived. They had also been visiting a recently widowed relative along the way, which meant that when the Wittelsbach women stepped out of their coaches in Bad Ischl, they were dressed in black mourning clothes, travel-worn slightly late, and without anything suitable to change into. Helene, groomed for this moment, looked exactly as composed as a woman can look after that kind of journey. And Sisi looked like someone who had just ridden through the wind for 2 days and could not be happier about it. The meeting was supposed to be straightforward. Franz Joseph I was 23 years old. He had been emperor since he was 18, placed on the throne, amid the chaos of revolution shaped by his mother, into a ruler of discipline and duty. He was handsome in a careful military way. He followed protocol. He respected the plan. The plan was Helene, but when Franz Joseph walked into the room at Bad Ischl that evening, and his eyes found Sisi standing slightly apart in her black dress, with that particular quality she had of looking at the world like she was not entirely sure it deserved her attention, something shifted. He asked to sit beside her at dinner. He danced with her. The next morning he told his mother he had made his decision. His mother, Archduchess Sophie, this same woman who had engineered this entire meeting, who had chosen Helene, who had an exact vision of what the next Empress of Austria should be, stared at her son and tried to understand what she was hearing. He wanted the 15-year-old, the one who skipped lessons, the one who smelled faintly of horses, the one who had not been prepared for any of this. Franz Joseph reportedly told his mother in terms that left no room for negotiation, "If I cannot have Sisi, I shall not marry anyone at all." And that was that. 5 days after their first meeting, the engagement was officially announced. 8 months later, on April 24th, 1854, 16-year-old Elizabeth of Bavaria became Empress of Austria. Now I want to pause here for just a second, because there is a version of this story, the version told in films, in musicals, on the shelves of Viennese souvenir shops, where this moment is pure romance. The emperor sees the girl. He falls in love. She falls in love. The music swells, and it is romantic in a way. It genuinely is. But there is another way to see this moment. A 15-year-old girl who had spent her entire life running free, who had never been groomed for empire, never been trained in the rituals of the Habsburg court, who skipped her lessons to ride horses and read poetry by the lake, was just handed the most demanding role in the most rigidly ceremonial royal court in all of Europe. She did not ask for it. She had no idea what she was walking into. Her own sister Helene, the one who had spent years preparing for exactly this, apparently exhaled in relief when she heard the news. She later said she was genuinely glad it had not been her. Which tells you something. And what about Sisi? By all accounts, she was genuinely dazzled by Franz Joseph. He was charming, attentive, tall, and obviously smitten with her, in a way that felt nothing like obligation. She wrote in her letters that she loved him deeply and sincerely, but she also wrote something else, something that looking back reads almost like a prophecy. She wrote, "I love the emperor so much, if only he were not the emperor, if only he were not the emperor." She understood it even then at 15 that the crown was not a gift, it was a trade. And the thing she was trading away was the one thing she had built her whole self around, her freedom. By the time her wedding day arrived in Vienna, the city had erupted in celebration. Thousands lined the streets, flowers were thrown, cannons were fired, church bells rang across the city for hours. The wedding ceremony at the Augustinerkirche took place with over 1,000 guests, 70 bishops among them, and lasted so long in the heat and the pageantry that Sisi by the end of it could barely stand. When it was finally over, she and Franz Joseph walked back through the palace corridors together, and then came 2 more hours of receiving wedding guests, and then dinner served at 10 o'clock at night, by which time Sisi had no appetite at all. Her father, Duke Maximilian, who had come to Vienna for the wedding, and found the entire Habsburg court utterly suffocating quietly, took his daughter aside before he left and told her something that has stayed in the historical record ever since. He said he could not tolerate Vienna's court etiquette himself, not even for a visit. And then he went home to Bavaria, to his circuses and his countryside and his freedom. And Sisi, his daughter, so much like him, watched him go. That night, as the celebrations continued around her 16-year-old Empress Elisabeth of Austria, sat in a palace that would be her new home. She'd arrived in a city that worshipped her. She had married a man who adored her. She was surrounded by more luxury than most people could dream of in a lifetime, and she was by every account that survives quietly and profoundly lost. She was the most celebrated woman in Europe, and she was already beginning to disappear. That feeling, that particular ache of a person pressed into a shape that does not fit them, is something we're going to follow very closely in this story. Because what happened to Sisi after that wedding night is not just history. It is a portrait of what happens when a wild thing is put in a beautiful cage. And the cage, the rituals, the protocols, the woman who ran it all from behind the scenes is what we are stepping into right now. Coming up next, the golden bars of the Habsburg court and the one woman who held the keys. So, she's married now, 16 years old, Empress of Austria, the most talked about woman on the continent. The wedding had been everything a royal ceremony is supposed to be. The golden carriages, the church bells shaking the Vienna air, 1,000 guests in their finest streets, so thick with people that the whole city felt like one enormous held breath. And when it was finally over, when the candles burned low and the guests went home, and the heavy doors of the Habsburg palace closed behind her, Sisi was alone in a palace that felt nothing like home. She had just stepped from one world into another, and the distance between those two worlds was not measured in kilometers. It was measured in something far harder to cross. Let me tell you about the Habsburg. Because to understand what happened to Sisi in those first weeks and months, you have to understand the place she'd just moved into. The Habsburg Palace in Vienna was not simply a building. It was an entire universe of protocol, a centuries-old system of rules, hierarchies, rituals, and expectations so layered and so rigid that it had its own gravitational pull. The etiquette at the Habsburg court traced its roots all the way back to the Spanish court of the 16th century. That is not a metaphor. The formal code of behaviour that governed every meal, every greeting, every public appearance had been imported, adapted, and calcified over 300 years into something almost theological in its precision. There were rules for how you entered a room, rules for how you sat, rules for how you ate, what you ate in what order, with which utensils observed by how many attendants, rules for how a woman curtsied to whom, and at what depth. There were rules for which topics could be discussed in which company and rules about what subjects were permanently completely off the table. Every morning of Sisi's life was now scripted before she opened her eyes, and the person holding that script, the one who had written most of it herself, who enforced it, who judged every deviation from it with a look that could strip paint, was not Sisi's husband. It was his mother, Archduchess Sophie of Austria. I need you to really see this woman for a moment, because history has been a little unfair to her, reduced her to the role of villain in a fairy tale. The truth is considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. Sophie had come to Vienna herself as a young woman, a Bavarian princess married into the Habsburg dynasty at 19. She had spent decades watching weak men make poor decisions, watching the empire wobble through revolution and crisis, and she had decided quietly, methodically, absolutely that she was not going to let it fall apart on her watch. By the time Franz Joseph was 18, and placed on the throne in 1848 during the revolutions that were sweeping across Europe, it was Sophie who had manoeuvred him there. It was Sophie who had steered the family through the chaos, pushed her own husband to step aside, and put her son in position to reign. The court, with its particular kind of dry wit, had taken to calling her the only man in the Habsburg. She was not entirely wrong to be proud of that. But here is the thing about people who have fought very hard to build a very specific order: they tend to be catastrophically bad at tolerating anything that disrupts it. And 16-year-old Sisi, who had grown up wild and unscheduled and deeply herself, was the most disruptive thing Sophie had ever encountered. Sophie had initially looked at her young daughter-in-law the way a sculptor might look at unfinished clay: pliable, mouldable. She had not anticipated that the clay had opinions. She called Sisi a silly young mother, and that was to Franz Joseph's face. One can only imagine what she said when he was not in the room. Think about what it actually meant to live under that kind of pressure. You wake up in the morning in a bed that belongs to an institution rather than to you. Your schedule has been set not by you, not even by your husband, but by a system of ceremonial obligations that predates everyone in the building. Your ladies-in-waiting, who are also, let's be honest, your watchers, are already assembled. Your clothing has been selected. Your meals will be determined by protocol. The people you will receive today, the order in which you will receive them, the precise length of each audience, all of it decided. And somewhere down the hall your mother-in-law is already awake, has probably been awake for hours, is already running things. Sisi began showing symptoms of what today we might recognize as severe anxiety almost immediately after arriving in Vienna. Within weeks of the wedding, she had developed persistent coughing fits that her physicians could not explain. She suffered what historians describe as panic-like responses, a particular fear of narrow staircases that became so acute she could barely descend them without trembling. Biographer Brigitte Heymann, who wrote the definitive scholarly biography of Elizabeth, describes a young woman whose body was essentially staging a protest, that her voice was not yet strong enough to mount. The court, of course, had very little patience for it. There is something worth sitting with here. Something that I think speaks well beyond the 19th century. How many of us have been in a situation, a job, a relationship, a family dynamic, where the rules were set before we arrived, where the expectations were enormous, and where the cost of not performing correctly was not just embarrassment, but a kind of erasure where you were expected to simply become the role Sisi was living that, except the role was Empress of Austria, and the audience was an entire empire. Now here is where the story takes a turn that even I find difficult to sit with. Just 10 months after her wedding, Sisi gave birth to her first child. She was 17 years old. The baby girl was healthy and beautiful, and before Sisi had even properly recovered, before she'd had more than a few moments with this new person she had grown inside her own body, Archduchess Sophie stepped in. She named the child. Without asking either parent, she named her Sophie after herself, and she took the baby to her own apartments to be raised under her supervision. Sisi was not permitted to breastfeed her own daughter. This was framed as a matter of court protocol and the health of the child. Wet nurses were provided. Routines were established. And Sisi, who'd been a mother for a matter of days, found herself on the other side of a closed door. When she wrote to her mother-in-law asking to spend more time with little Sophie, the response was, and this is documented, a polite but firm explanation that the Archduchess knew better how to care for the child, that Sisi was young and inexperienced, that this was simply how things were done. Franz Joseph, for all his adoration of his wife, was formed in the same institution as his mother. He'd been shaped since birth to understand that the empire came first, that protocol existed for reasons deeper than personal comfort, and that his mother was generally correct. He tried to soften things, he genuinely tried, but he did not overrule her. Sisi wrote in her private journal during this period, and the rawness of these entries is genuinely striking, that she felt like a guest in her own marriage, that she was allowed to be present without being allowed to be a person. A year later, a second daughter, Gisela, was born. Sophie took her too. I want to stop here for a moment and ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where someone else made a decision about your own life, your own body, your own family, and justified it so completely with authority and tradition that you almost started to believe they were right? Where the system around you was so total, so thoroughly convinced of itself, that your own instincts began to feel like the problem. That is the particular cruelty of what Sisi was living through. It was not dramatic. There was no villain twirling a moustache. It was simply a world that had decided with complete confidence what she was supposed to be. And the world was very, very good at communicating when she fell short. By 1856, just 2 years into her marriage, the coughing had worsened. There were longer stretches of what the court physicians diplomatically called nervous exhaustion. Sisi began spending extended periods away from Vienna at quieter residences, away from the ceremonies and the gays. The court gossips, of course, had opinions about this. They always do. But something was also shifting in Sisi during this time, something quiet and important. She was beginning to understand her situation with a clarity that she had perhaps not had at 16. The golden cage was real. The bars were not going to disappear because she wished them to. And if she was going to survive inside, it really survive, not just perform survival, she was going to have to find ways to be herself that the cage could not reach. She started learning Hungarian. This is worth dwelling on for a moment because it was not a small thing. Archduchess Sophie despised the Hungarians. She considered them difficult, proud, ungovernable people who had the irritating habit of demanding rights from an empire that felt it was doing them a favour by including them at all. Learning Hungarian was in the context of the Habsburg court an act of quiet defiance so clear that everyone could see it, but no one could quite object to. You could hardly forbid an empress from studying a language. Sisi did not just learn basic phrases, she became genuinely deeply fluent. She studied Hungarian history, Hungarian poetry, the long and complicated and proud story of a people who'd been fighting for their own identity for centuries. And in that story, perhaps she recognized something of her own. She hired Hungarian ladies-in-waiting. She began requesting Hungarian company. She started spending time in Hungary itself and the Hungarian people who could recognize a kindred spirit. When they saw one, adored her completely and instantly in return. Sophie fumed. Quietly, properly, in the way that people who have never lost an argument fume. But there was nothing she could do about it. In 1857, everything broke. Sisi had finally convinced Franz Joseph, and through him persuaded Sophie to allow her to take her children on a trip to Hungary. It was a diplomatic visit, public, formal, exactly the kind of imperial obligation Sisi was normally so reluctant to perform, but she agreed to it because it meant she would be with her daughters, both of them, actually with them in the same carriage for a journey. Little Sophie was 2 years old. Gisela was not yet 1. The trip began well. Hungary received the imperial family with genuine warmth. Sisi was visibly alive in a way she rarely managed at the Hofburg, laughing, engaging with the crowds, holding her daughter's hand in public. And then little Sophie fell ill, a fever at first, then severe sickness, then a desperate, terrifying decline that her physicians could not stop. On the evening of May 29, 1857, 2-year-old Archduchess Sophie died in her mother's arms in Budapest. Sisi was 19 years old. She'd been a mother for 2 years, had been permitted to actually mother for almost none of it, and now the child she had fought simply to hold was gone. The grief that followed was not the measured, ceremonial kind that the court expected of an empress. It was raw and total. She wept in a way that made the ladies-in-waiting uncomfortable. She could not eat. She could not sleep. She sat for hours in silence and then sobbed for hours more. The court, with its extraordinary gift for finding the wrong thing to say, suggested that perhaps she needed to compose herself, that there were duties, that the empire did not pause. Franz Joseph wept too quietly in private. He was devastated, but he also had a country to run, and he had been trained from birth to understand that personal grief did not excuse you from that. Sisi wore a locket with her daughter's image for the rest of her life. She wore it every single day, and historians who have gone through her private papers note that she returned to little Sophie in her journals and her poetry over and over again for decades, long after the court had moved on, long after it had stopped being appropriate to still be mourning. She never really stopped. What happened in the years that followed is in some ways the most psychologically fascinating part of Sisi's story. Because she did not break. She bent. She retreated. She disappeared into illness and into travel and into the private world of her own mind. But she did not become what the court wanted her to be. She did not become Sophie. She did not become the obedient ceremonial figure who smiled at banquets and curtsied to ambassadors and produced airs and kept her feelings neatly folded away in a drawer somewhere. Instead, she started slowly, carefully, and with considerable ingenuity to build an interior life so rich and so thoroughly her own that no protocol in the Habsburg rulebook could touch it. She wrote poetry in secret, dark, searching, beautiful poetry that nobody was allowed to read while she was alive. She read voraciously, not the improving literature that a proper empress was supposed to read, but philosophy, mythology, anything that asked uncomfortable questions about the nature of freedom and the self. She had exercise equipment installed in her private apartments at the Hofburg parallel bars, rings, gymnastic rings, and she used them every morning before the court woke up before the day's performance had to begin. The courtiers found this baffling, almost scandalous. Ladies did not do gymnastics. Empresses absolutely did not do gymnastics. The whole thing was deeply, inexplicably wrong. Sisi did not care. In 1858, Crown Prince Rudolf was born the long-awaited male heir, and his birth improved Sisi's position at court considerably. An empress who had produced a son was a different thing than an empress who had only daughters. The court's tone shifted slightly. Sophie's grip just fractionally loosened, and Sisi, who had been watching and learning and waiting with a patience that nobody gave her credit for, began to move. By the early 1860s, something in her had quietly hardened. She was no longer the overwhelmed teenager who had arrived in Vienna in a black dress, unprepared and uncertain. She had survived loss. She had survived Sophie. She had survived years inside a machine that had been designed to make her into something she was not. And she had arrived at a decision unspoken but absolute. She was going to be herself. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone could easily point to and punish, but in every small way that the institution could not quite reach in her horses, her languages, her poetry, her body, her relentless refusal to stop moving, to stop changing, to stop being inconveniently, stubbornly, magnificently alive. She was going to be herself. The court called it eccentricity. The public called it mystery. Historians looking back now with more generous eyes tend to call it survival. And what came next, the battle Sisi was building toward, the way she would turn her private stubbornness into something that actually changed the map of Europe, is a story that is even more extraordinary than the one we've just told, because the woman who'd been silenced, dismissed, grieving and controlled for the first decade of her marriage was about to find in the most unexpected corner of the continent the one cause that would bring every part of her roaring back to life. There is a question I keep coming back to every time I think about Sisi's life. Not the grand historical question, not about empires or politics or the long arc of the Habsburg dynasty. Something smaller than that, something more personal. When everything around you is controlled, your schedule, your children, your rooms, your meals, the precise angle at which you must bow your head, to whom and for how long, what do you reach for? What is the one thing they cannot take? For Sisi, the answer turned out to be her own body, and the story of what she did with that answer is one of the most psychologically fascinating and quietly heartbreaking chapters of her entire life. Let us set the scene properly. By the early 1860s, Sisi had been empress for nearly a decade. She had survived the crushing formality of the Hofburg. She had survived the relentless presence of Archduchess Sophie. She had survived the grief of losing her first daughter. She had given birth to 3 children, a fourth, Marie Valerie, would come later, and she had watched each of those children be taken from her hands and placed into someone else's care. She was in her early 20s, already by the standards of the Victorian age on the edge of what society considered middle age for a woman. The court was full of people watching her, judging the lines around her eyes, measuring her against the magnificent portrait that Franz Xaver Winterhalter had painted of her at 28, in a white gown with diamond stars scattered through her dark hair like the night sky over Vienna. That portrait became one of the most famous images of any European royal of the century. It is still reproduced today on chocolates on magnets on the walls of the Sisi Museum in Vienna, which draws millions of visitors every year. Sisi's image captured at the height of her beauty, frozen in time by a painter who knew exactly what he was doing. And Sisi herself, looking at it, decided something. She was not going to let time touch her. Not if she could help it. Now, before we go any further, I want to say something that I think is important. What I am about to describe is going to sound in parts impressive. The discipline, the dedication, the sheer force of will involved. But the more you understand the context, the more you understand what was happening around her and inside her during these years, the less impressive it starts to look. And the more it starts to look like something else entirely. Something that a lot of historians and more than a few modern psychologists have looked at and recognized with a particular kind of quiet sadness. This was not vanity in the ordinary sense of the word. This was something more complicated, more urgent, more necessary to her. Keep that in mind as we go. Sisi stood 5 feet 8 inches tall. In the 19th century, that was unusually tall for a woman. She carried herself with the natural elegance that people wrote about from the moment they met her, that particular combination of height and posture, and the way she moved through rooms as if she were already somewhere else. But elegance to the court was not enough. An empress had to be beautiful, specifically measurably publicly beautiful. She had to embody a particular standard, slender, composed, luminous, and she had to maintain that standard. As the years accumulated, the pregnancies came and went, and the relentless machinery of court life ground on. Sisi took that expectation, and she ran with it far past any boundary the court had intended. Her hair became her first great project. It grew to reach her ankles. Chestnut-coloured, extraordinarily thick, and almost architectural cascade when it was loosened. Biographer Brigitte Hamann described it as a cascade that enveloped her like a cloak. Sisi herself, in one of her more self-aware moments, called it her crowning glory. She was more proud of her hair than of almost anything else about herself. Maintaining it required extraordinary effort. Every single morning Sisi sat down in her private apartments on a chair, specially positioned with a silk cloth laid beneath her hair, so that not a strand would be damaged on the floor, and submitted to the ministrations of her personal hairdresser. A woman named Franziska Pfeifferlich, who became known at court simply as Fanny, and whose entire professional existence revolved around the state of one woman's hair. The daily routine took between 2 and 3 hours, 2 to 3 hours, every morning. Before the day had properly begun, Fanny had to work in white gloves, no rings, nothing that could catch or damage a strand. And when she was finished, when the braiding was complete, when the elaborate upswept style had been pinned into place, when the legendary diamond stars made by court jeweller Kuschert had been positioned just so she was required to present to Sisi in a silver bowl every hair that had come loose during the process. Every single hair. If the number of fallen hairs was too great, Sisi would become distressed, and Fanny, who understood perfectly well which side her bread was buttered on, had been known to slip the more alarming strands quietly into her apron pocket, before presenting the bowl to spare everyone the scene. Once Sisi caught her doing this, you can imagine that conversation. Sisi actually wrote about the exhaustion of her own hair ritual in her private notes. There is a line that has stayed with me since I first read it, a line that is funny and sad in equal measure. She wrote, "I am a slave to my hair." The woman who was legally one of the most powerful people in Europe was a slave to her hair. Every 3 weeks the hair had to be washed. This was not a casual operation. It took an entire day. The mixture used was cognac and raw eggs, a combination that sounds more like a cocktail than a shampoo. but which was believed at the time to preserve the shine and strength of the hair. After washing, the hair had to be dried, and since there were obviously no modern appliances in the 1860s, drying was accomplished by Sisi walking, back and forth, up and down the corridors of whichever palace she was in a long waterproof silk dressing gown, hair loose around her, walking until it was dry. The courtiers found this eccentric. Everything about Sisi's private rituals struck the court as somewhere between eccentric and faintly alarming, but she did not do any of it for them. Now the hair was in its way manageable. It was a ritual. It had its own internal logic, something to maintain something, to tend something that rewarded care with visible results. The exercise regime was something rather different. Before sunrise most mornings, before the court was awake, before the ceremonial obligations of the day had begun to press down on her, Sisi was already at work. She'd had gymnastics equipment installed in her private apartments at the Habsburg. Rings, parallel bars, wall bars. Equipment that looked, as one contemporary observer noted with visible bewilderment, as if a circus had briefly taken up residence in the imperial palace. She worked on this equipment with a focus and a discipline that her ladies-in-waiting struggled to keep up with. She rode for hours every day, and became genuinely one of the finest equestrians in Europe, not as a hobby, not as a gentle royal pastime, but at an elite level that impressed professional riders. She took on hunting courses in England and Ireland that were considered dangerously challenging even for experienced male riders, and she navigated them with what multiple witnesses described as complete fearlessness. In her later decades, when joint pain began to limit her riding, she transferred that same relentless energy to walking. Long walks, sometimes 5, 6, 7 hours at a stretch, through mountains, through countryside, at a pace that left her attendants gasping. There are accounts of her ladies-in-waiting having to be picked up by carriage because they simply could not keep pace with an empress, who was by that point well into middle age and showed absolutely no signs of slowing down. She took up fencing in her 50s. In the 1880s, a woman in her 50s picking up fencing was not a small thing. It was almost aggressively unusual. And then there was the diet. This is the part of Sisi's story that I want to approach carefully because I think it deserves something more than the admiring tone it sometimes gets in popular accounts. What Sisi ate or did not eat during the latter decades of her life was extreme by any measure. Historians who have studied her medical records and the accounts of those close to her have noted patterns that, viewed through a modern lens, suggest a serious and entrenched relationship with food that went well beyond simple discipline. She ate very little, often alarmingly little. In her later years, she survived largely on orange juice steak broth, the liquid pressed from raw beef, egg whites, and sorbet. Sometimes just 2 oranges and a small sorbet for the entire day. She weighed herself multiple times daily, sometimes 3 times in a single morning, and the number on the scale had the power to entirely determine her mood. By 1894, she was 56 years old. By then she had reached her lowest recorded weight, somewhere around 95 pounds on a 5'8" frame. Physicians who examined her in her later years noted what they called famine edema, swelling caused by severe nutritional deficiency. Her own ladies-in-waiting worried. Franz Joseph worried. But nobody quite knew how to reach her. There is a detail that I find both telling and heartbreaking. In 1881, Sisi purchased a small English country house and had a private spiral staircase constructed inside it, connecting her sitting room directly to the kitchen, so that she could go there in the middle of the night without being seen, without anyone knowing. Historians have noted delicately that this may suggest moments of intense hunger of eating in secret after long periods of restriction. The full picture of what she was experiencing is something that her private writings, which were not published until long after her death, only partly illuminate. I am not going to put a diagnostic label on what Sisi was living with. That is not my place, and frankly, the historical distance makes any confident assessment impossible. But I will say this. When someone has had every meaningful form of control taken from them, their children, their schedule, their role, their public image, her voice, and they turn with such intense and consuming focus to controlling the one physical thing that remains entirely theirs that is not vanity. That is not even really about beauty. That is a person trying to survive the only way they know how. The body became the territory that no one could legislate, and she defended it with everything she had. Now here is what makes this more interesting, not just sad, but genuinely complicated in the way that real human beings are complicated. Sisi was also simultaneously something of a pioneer. In the 1860s and 1870s, the idea of a woman exercising seriously not a gentle promenade through a garden, but actually sweating, working muscles, building strength and skill, was considered somewhere between inappropriate and absurd. Women of rank did not do such things. The body was not a project, it was a decoration. Sisi did not care. She had her gymnasium, she had her riding trails. She walked further and harder than anyone around her. She fenced in her 50s. And because she was the Empress of Austria, nobody could actually stop her. They could gossip, they could raise their eyebrows, they could murmur about it in antechambers, but they could not take away her parallel bars. In the decades after her death, as the early fitness movement began to emerge in Europe, people would look back at Sisi with a kind of retrospective admiration. A woman who had understood almost a century ahead of her time that physical strength was something worth building and maintaining, that the body was capable of more than its decorative role suggested. There is something true in that, but there is also something important that gets lost when the story is told only from that angle. Let me tell you about one particular winter day somewhere in the mid-1860s. It was the middle of the social season in Vienna, the city's aristocratic calendar, a relentless schedule of balls and receptions and formal dinners that went on for months. An empress was expected to be present, to be dazzling, to fulfill the role that the institution required of her. Sisi arrived at one such event wrapped in a gown from the Parisian couturier Charles Frederick Worth, the most celebrated dressmaker in the world at the time, whose clients included royalty across the continent. The gown required the corset to be laced to 19.5 inches. That is a number, if you have never considered it in physical terms, that is difficult to fully imagine on a human body. Lacing that corset took a full hour. Sisi stood for it without complaint. She moved through the evening with what witnesses consistently described as extraordinary grace. She ate almost nothing at dinner. She spoke when spoken to, smiled when required, and withdrew at the earliest opportunity. The next morning she was on her gymnastic rings before the sun was fully up. This was her life. This was the contract she'd written with herself. The court saw elegance. What they did not see, what nobody was supposed to see, was the work behind it. The discipline, the deprivation, the hours and hours of physical effort that produced the image everyone admired. The exhaustion, the weighing herself in the early morning light alone before anyone could watch. One of her biographers notes that Sisi once described her own appearance in private correspondence, in terms that were startlingly ungenerous, not with the confidence of a woman who knew she was beautiful, but with the anxious, restless dissatisfaction of someone who could never quite arrive at the thing she was reaching for. That is perhaps the detail that lodges most uncomfortably in the mind. The woman that all of Europe called the most beautiful empress of the century did not in her private moments feel that she had achieved anything worth keeping. And then because Sisi contained multitudes, and this is what made her genuinely extraordinary, rather than simply tragic, there is the tattoo. In 1888, Sisi was 51 years old. She visited a harbour town. Accounts differ on the exact location, but most agree it was somewhere on her Mediterranean travels, and she walked into a tattoo parlour. A real one, the kind frequented by sailors and dock workers, the absolute last place anyone expected to find an Empress of Austria. And she had a small blue anchor tattooed on her left shoulder. An anchor. For the sea, she loved the freedom of open water, the life of perpetual motion she had chosen over the stifling routine of the palace. When the court heard about it, and they did hear about it, eventually the reaction was somewhere between horror and bafflement. An empress with a tattoo, at 51, in a sailor's parlour. Franz Joseph was reportedly not pleased. Sisi, by all accounts, was delighted. There is something about that image, the Empress of Austria, 51 years old, sitting in a harbour tattoo parlour, choosing an anchor that feels like a declaration, not a loud one, not a political speech or a public protest, just a quiet, permanent, deeply personal statement about who she was underneath all the protocol and the corsets and the diamond stars in her legendary hair. I am a person, it said. I contain things you did not choose for me. I am not only what you see. By the late 1880s and into the 1890s, something in Sisi's relationship with her own body had shifted from discipline into something more compulsive, more driven. The weighing 3 times a day. The walks that went on until her companions were in physical distress. The diet that had narrowed to almost nothing. Those around her who loved her, and there were people who genuinely loved her, watched with a kind of helpless concern. They could see what was happening. They did not know what to do, and Sisi for her part kept moving. That was in the end what she did best, what she had always done. She kept moving. Not because the destination was clear, not because the movement fixed anything, but because stillness for her had always been the thing that came with the cage. And she was never going to be still if she could help it. Which brings us in a way to the most quietly radical thing Sisi ever did with her body. Not the gymnastics, not the riding, not even the tattoo. It was this: after the age of 32, she stopped allowing her portrait to be painted. She stopped sitting for photographs. She began appearing in public with a fan held just so, or a parasol angled to shield her face, or a veil drawn over her features. In the final decades of her life, only her closest ladies-in-waiting saw her face clearly. The woman who had been reproduced in oil and daguerreotype and etching across Europe simply withdrew, refused to be seen. The last major photograph of her was taken when she was round 30. The last portrait painted from life was completed when she was 40. She was 60 when she died. And the world still pictured her as she'd been at 28 in white silk and diamond stars. She had chosen that. She'd decided with the same absolute precision she brought to everything else that she would live on in the public's imagination exactly as she wished to be remembered. Young, beautiful, forever just out of reach. It was the one image she could truly control, and in the end she controlled it completely. Coming up in the next chapter of this story, something shifts. The woman who had turned inward, who had built her private world so carefully against the press of empire, suddenly turns outward. And what she does next shocks the Habsburg court, reshapes the political map of Europe, and earns her an adoration from an entire nation that would outlast her by more than 100 years. Because the rebel had found her cause, and the cause was Hungary. Picture this for a moment. It is January of 1866. The grand ballroom of Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, chandeliers blazing the Viennese aristocracy, in their finest, the kind of evening where every conversation is a performance, and every glance carries diplomatic weight. A Hungarian delegation has arrived. Important men, politicians and noblemen representing a nation that had been grinding against Habsburg authority for nearly 2 decades, a nation that still remembered bitterly the reprisals that followed their failed revolution of 1848. The executions, the exiles, the long cold silence of a wounded people forced to submit. The delegation is received. The formalities proceed. And then during the course of the evening, one particular exchange happens, quiet, brief, conducted in a language that almost no one else in the room understands. Sisi speaks to Count Gyula Andrassy in Hungarian, not haltingly, not with the careful apologetic slowness of someone working through a foreign tongue. She speaks with genuine fluency in a language that is notoriously difficult, one that most Central Europeans consider essentially impenetrable. She's been studying it for years. And now, in front of a delegation that had come expecting cold formality, the Empress of Austria turns to the most important Hungarian statesman in the room and speaks to him as if she belongs to his world. The effect, by all accounts, was electric. To understand why that moment mattered, you need to understand what Hungary was and what it meant in the Habsburg world of the 1860s. The Hungarian people had a long and complicated relationship with the Habsburg dynasty, stretching back centuries marked by fierce pride, repeated attempts at autonomy, and the particular bitterness of a nation that considered itself not a subject of the empire but a partner in it, governed by its own ancient constitution, its own parliament, its own traditions. In 1848 and 1849, during the great wave of revolutions that swept across Europe, Hungary had risen dramatically, passionately, and ultimately unsuccessfully against Habsburg control. The suppression that followed was severe. 13 Hungarian generals were executed. Hundreds went into exile. The old Hungarian constitution was suspended. Budapest simmered. Franz Joseph, who had come to power during that revolution, and whose very reign had begun in the fire of suppression, was not beloved in Hungary. He was tolerated at best. He was in many Hungarian hearts the face of everything that had gone wrong. Sisi, on the other hand, Sisi was something else entirely. Her connection to Hungary had begun in the most unlikely way through her mother-in-law's contempt. Archduchess Sophie despised the Hungarians. She considered them difficult, proud, ungovernable, a constant source of headaches for the empire she'd worked so hard to stabilize. She made no particular effort to hide this view, and Sisi, who had developed a finely tuned instinct for identifying anything Sophie disapproved of and then investigating it thoroughly, began in the late 1850s to learn Hungarian. That was how it started. A small act of quiet defiance. But something happened as she studied something that went beyond mere opposition. She read Hungarian history, Hungarian poetry, the long story of a people who had spent centuries fighting to remain themselves against forces that wanted to absorb them, define them, contain them. And somewhere in that story she found something that felt like a mirror. The historian Brigitte Heyman, whose definitive biography of Elizabeth remains the most authoritative account of her life, describes the connection Sisi felt to Hungary as genuinely, almost viscerally personal. Here was a nation that refused to be what the Habsburg system required it to be. Here was a people who insisted, despite everything, on their own language, their own laws, their own particular proud way of being in the world. She recognized them. By 1866, the world around the Habsburg Empire had shifted dramatically and not in Vienna's favor. Austria had lost a humiliating war against Prussia that summer. The 7 Weeks' War, sometimes called the Austro-Prussian War, settled in a single decisive battle at Königgrätz in Bohemia on July 3, 1866. The Prussian military machine, more modern and more efficient than anyone had quite anticipated, crushed the Habsburg forces in less than 2 months. The defeat cost Austria its position as the leading German power, a role it had held for centuries. It was one of the greatest strategic shocks in the empire's long history. While the Prussian troops were still advancing, while Franz Joseph was still processing the magnitude of what had just happened to his army and his reputation, Sisi did something remarkable. Against the explicit wishes of Archduchess Sophie, She packed up her children and left Vienna for Budapest. Not the most obvious time to take a family trip, but there was nothing casual about it. Budapest was a statement. Going there in that particular moment with the empire reeling and the future uncertain was a declaration of allegiance, quiet, personal, and unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The Hungarians noticed. When her train pulled into the station in Budapest, the reception was extraordinary. Hungarian political leaders among them, Count Gyula Andrassy himself, and the great statesman Ferenc Diak, who'd been working for years toward a constitutional compromise with Austria, came to the station to greet her personally. The crowds in the streets were not the polite formal crowds of Vienna's ceremonial occasions. These were people who were genuinely unreservedly delighted that she had come. Gyula Andrassy. Let me spend a moment on him because he deserves one. Andrassy was one of the most remarkable men of his generation. Dashingly handsome, politically brilliant, possessed of the particular magnetism that seems to belong to people who've been in exile and come back transformed by it. He had taken part in the Hungarian Revolution of 1848 and been condemned to death in absentia. By Franz Joseph's court had even been hung in effigy, a symbolic execution. His name literally nailed to a gallows in Pest, and had spent years abroad before eventually receiving amnesty and returning to Hungary. The Viennese court, with its sly gift for memorable nicknames, called him the Beautiful Hanged Man. He and Sisi met properly for the first time in January of 1866. By the end of that first conversation, something had formed between them that would last for the rest of his life, a bond that has fascinated historians ever since, that has been argued over in biographies and academic papers for a century, and that neither of them ever fully explained to anyone's satisfaction. Was it romantic? Was it entirely platonic? The honest answer is that no one knows for certain. The historical record is careful on this point. What we do know is that Andrassy wrote letters to Sisi that were warmer than the letters most men wrote to empresses. We know that they spoke privately, that they corresponded regularly in Hungarian, a language that served as a kind of code between them, a private channel that most of the court could not monitor. We know that when Andrassy died in 1890, Sisi declared, openly and without any attempt at restraint, "My last and only friend is dead." And we know that when her own biographers pressed her on the nature of the relationship, Sisi offered one of the more elegant deflections in the historical record. She described their connection as a faithful friendship, and it was not poisoned by love, meaning, as she made clear in context, physical love, not poisoned by love. That is either the most honest thing ever said about a complicated friendship, or the most beautifully worded thing ever said about something considerably more complicated. Either way, I find it endlessly interesting. But here is what matters most politically and historically, whatever the personal nature of their connection. What Sisi and Andrassy accomplished together was genuinely significant. Not in a decorative symbolic way, in a real structural map rewriting way. After Austria's devastating defeat by Prussia in 1866, the empire faced a choice. It could try to maintain the old rigid structure, the German-dominated, centralized, inflexible order that Sophie and her generation had built, or it could adapt. Become something new. Find a way to transform weakness into a different kind of strength. Franz Joseph, who was many things but not a foolish man, understood that something had to change. The question was what and how and with whom. Sisi pushed him toward Hungary. She did not do this through public speeches or formal political appearances. She did not stand up in any chamber or sign any document. She did it the way women in her position had always had to do it, through conversation, through letters, through the slow, patient, persistent work of changing one person's mind about one very large question. She wrote to Franz Joseph in terms that left no ambiguity about her position. There is a letter preserved in the historical record that she sent to her husband during the most difficult period of the negotiations, and the directness of it is striking coming from a woman who was officially supposed to stay well clear of political affairs. She wrote to him about Andrassy. "I have just had an interview with Andrassy. He set forth his views clearly and plainly. I quite understood them and arrived at the conclusion that if you would trust him, and trust him entirely, we might still be saved. Not only Hungary, but the monarchy too. Not only Hungary, but the monarchy too." She was not lobbying for a cause she found personally sympathetic. She was making a strategic argument about the survival of the empire her husband led, and she was making it clearly, confidently in her own name. Franz Josef listened. In February of 1867, after years of negotiation and political manoeuvring, the Austro-Hungarian Compromise, the Ausgleich, was signed into effect. The old unitary empire became something new, the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. 2 capitals, Vienna and Budapest. 2 parliaments. 2 separate governments for most internal affairs. Hungary regained its ancient constitution, its own prime minister, its own language as the official language of administration. Only foreign affairs, military matters, and the shared finances were held in common. For Hungary, it was a transformation. For Austria, it was an acknowledgement that the world had changed, and that the empire had to change with it. For historians, it is one of the most significant political reorganizations in 19th century European history, and a woman who had no official political role in any of it was widely understood by the people who were present to have been one of its crucial architects. The Hungarian statesman Ferenc Deák, one of the great minds behind the compromise, said afterward, "It is important to remember that the Empress was the beautiful providence granted to the Hungarian fatherland. Beautiful providence. The Hungarians were not known for understatement. On June 8, 1867, in the Matthias Church in Budapest, Franz Joseph and Elizabeth were crowned King and Queen of Hungary. The preparations had begun weeks earlier. Hundreds of boxes and chests had been sent from Vienna to Budapest on steamers down the Danube. The day itself began at 4 in the morning with a 21-gun salute from the citadel above the city. By 7, the procession from Budapest Castle had begun. Count Andrassy, walking ahead of 11 standard-bearers carrying the Holy Crown of Hungary on a velvet cushion. The city had turned out in numbers that overwhelmed even the most optimistic estimates. Every street, every balcony, every rooftop that had a view of the procession route was crowded. And then Elizabeth. She arrived in the ornamental carriage that had once carried Queen Maria Theresa during her own coronation nearly a century earlier. She wore a gown of white silk richly embroidered with silver, in a style that was unmistakably Hungarian. She had designed it herself as a deliberate statement. Around her head a coronet of diamonds, and when she stepped out, the crowd's reaction was something that multiple witnesses described as unlike anything they had ever heard from a crowd. Not polite applause, not the formal, restrained acknowledgement of a ceremonial occasion. Something rawer and more genuine than that. Franz Joseph praised his wife in a letter written during their Hungarian visits, with a frankness that is rather touching, coming from a man not known for his warmth. "Sisi is of great help to me with her courtesy, her exquisite tact, and her good Hungarian, in which the people are less reluctant to hear some rebuke from lovely lips. Franz Joseph, in his careful, dutiful way, had noticed something important, that Sisi had a kind of authority with the Hungarian people that he could never have. Something personal, something felt, something that transcended the formal structures of ceremony and protocol. She could reach people that the empire on its own could not. After the coronation, Sisi received a gift from the new Hungarian government. Gödöllő Palace, a magnificent Baroque country house 20 miles northeast of Budapest, set in forested countryside that reminded her perhaps of the landscape of her Bavarian childhood. The Hungarians had bought it specifically for her as a coronation present from the nation to its new queen. Franz Joseph had actually refused to buy it for her himself the year before on the grounds that, in these hard times, we must save mightily. Hungary bought it for her anyway. She spent more time there than anywhere else for the rest of her life. More than at the Hofburg in Vienna, more than at Schönbrunn. She rode there every day when she was in residence, hunted in the surrounding fields, walked for hours through the landscape and described the feeling of being at Godolo in terms that she rarely used about any other place. "Here no one disturbs me," she wrote, "as if I were living in a village where I can come and go as I please. As I please." 2 words that for Sisi contained a whole world. There is a question worth sitting with here, and I ask it not to diminish anything, but because I think it is genuinely interesting. Was Sisi's love for Hungary entirely selfless? The honest answer is probably not entirely. The historians are careful on this point. Hungary gave Sisi things that Vienna could not. The Hungarians loved her without demanding that she perform imperially. They allowed her to be herself, or at least a version of herself, in a way that the Habsburg court had never permitted. Godolo was an escape. Budapest was air. The Hungarian people who adored her with a fervour that bordered on the mythological asked nothing of her except to be present. Whether you call that genuine political conviction or a remarkably effective mutual arrangement, the result was real. Sisi became for the Hungarians something close to a sacred figure. A queen who spoke their language, wore their national dress, hunted their fields, filled her staff with their countrymen, and had, as they firmly believed and as the historical record largely supports, used her influence over her husband to give them back their constitutional rights. Long after her death, the Hungarians named a bridge after her, the Elisabeth Bridge, spanning the Danube between Buda and Pest. They placed statues of her in public squares. They wrote poems about her. The affection was not manufactured. It was not the product of a public relations campaign or a carefully managed image. It was the response of a people who felt genuinely that she had chosen them, and that is not a small thing in any language. By 1868, the year after the coronation, Sisi was pregnant again for the first time in nearly a decade. The child, a daughter named Marie Valerie, was born in Budapest. Sisi called her "my Hungarian child," with a warmth she had not been permitted to express toward any of her earlier children. Because here, away from Vienna, away from the court that had taken her first daughters and placed them in her mother-in-law's hands, away from the protocols and the watchers, and the whole elaborate machinery of the Hofburg here, Sisi was allowed to be a mother. She raised Marie Valerie herself, brought her along on her travels, spoke to her in Hungarian, formed with her a bond that was everything she had been denied with Sophie, with Gisela, with Rudolph. The court in Vienna did not particularly approve. Some members of the aristocracy found the whole Hungarian chapter, the language, the palace, the barely concealed preference something between baffling and offensive. Archduchess Sophie, who had despised the Hungarians and who had spent a decade trying to shape Sisi into a proper Habsburg empress, watched all of this from Vienna. She died in 1872. The historical record does not preserve Sisi's private response to that news, but her biographers have noted with varying degrees of diplomacy that Sisi found the atmosphere at the Austrian court considerably more bearable afterward. Here is what I keep thinking about when I reflect on this chapter of Sisi's life. She was a woman who had no official political power, who was not permitted to vote, to hold office, to speak in any formal political setting, to sign any document that would carry legal weight in the governance of the empire. And yet, by the assessment of the Hungarian politicians who were there, who negotiated the compromise, who watched it happen in real time, she was one of the forces that made it possible. Not through authority, not through any formal channel, through relationships, through language, through the slow, patient, unglamorous work of being a person that someone important trusted and using that trust in the direction of something she believed in. It is not the version of power that history tends to celebrate. It does not look like a speech or a battle or a signed treaty. It looks like a conversation in Hungarian in a Vienna ballroom. It looks like getting on a train to Budapest during a war. It looks like a woman pressing her husband in letter after letter to trust a man that the court considered dangerous. But it changed things. It actually changed things. And I think that is worth more than a footnote. There are still statues of her in Budapest. The bridge still bears her name. More than a century after her death, the Hungarians have not forgotten what she did, or what she represented, or what it meant that she chose them when she could have chosen almost anywhere else. Some things, it turns out, outlast empires. The rebellion she staged was not the loud public kind. It was quieter and stranger and more difficult to measure, and because of that, more difficult to stop. She had rewritten the rules of the empire without anyone being able to quite point to the moment it happened. And there was one more dimension of Sisi's inner life, one that ran alongside all of this, beneath all of it, stranger and darker and more private than anything she ever showed the court that we have not yet touched. She kept secrets, not small ones. She wrote in private things that the world was not permitted to read for decades after her death. And when those writings were finally opened, what they revealed was not the empress anyone had expected. That is what comes next. Somewhere in Switzerland on the 3rd of July 1951, a locked strongbox arrived at the office of the President of the Swiss Confederation. It had travelled a long way to get there, kept for decades by Sisi's brother, Duke Karl Theodor of Bavaria, and then passed on to his son. After his death, the box had moved quietly through the upheavals of 2 world wars across the chaos of the 20th century, arriving finally in Bern, battered by time, sealed tight, and carrying inside it something that the Empress of Austria had not wanted the world to see, until she was absolutely certain it could no longer hurt anyone she cared about. The men who gathered to open it, the President of Switzerland, the Federal Chancellor, the head of the administrative department, the federal prosecutor, were by one historical account expecting important state documents. Political correspondence, perhaps. Diplomatic papers of some significance. What they found instead were volumes of poetry. Thousands of lines of verse written in the hand of a woman who'd been dead for over 50 years, covering everything from the most intimate private emotions to blistering, wickedly funny satirical portraits of the Habsburg court and everyone in it. The officials in the room were, according to that same historical account, probably a little dumbfounded. That, I think, is an understatement. Here is the thing that strikes me most about Sisi's poetry, and about the whole extraordinary story of how it survived. She planned this. The strong box, the 60-year delay, the Swiss government, the instructions about what to do with it, all of it was designed with considerable forethought by a woman who understood exactly what she was doing and exactly why it had to be done this way. In 1890, Sisi wrote a letter addressed in her characteristically poetic way to the souls of the future, that she sealed with the box. The letter explained her reasoning. She believed that her writings were too honest, too critical, too fundamentally at odds with the world she inhabited to be safe, while that world still existed as she knew it. She wrote that she hoped the people who read her work 60 years hence would be more open, more modern, more willing to understand a woman who had never quite fit the shape the world had made for her. She wrote, "Even 60 years from now, happiness and peace, which is to say freedom, will perhaps not yet be at home on our small planet, as it has not been in my time, but perhaps you dear future souls will be closer to it." She identified herself in her poems with the fairy queen Titania from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Her husband, Franz Joseph, was Oberon. The Habsburg court was full of donkeys. She was not wrong about any of them. But before we get to what was inside the box, before we get to the poems themselves, it is worth spending a moment on the person who made them possible, the mind that shaped Sisi's inner world more than any other single influence, Heinrich Heine. Heine was a German Jewish poet born in Düsseldorf in 1797, who spent much of his adult life in exile in Paris because his political writing was too dangerous for him to publish freely in his homeland. His work was banned in Austria and across most of the German Confederation. He died in 1856 before Sisi was 20 years old. He never knew she existed, and yet she considered him her closest companion for the better part of her adult life. This requires a little explanation. Sisi had discovered Heine's poetry sometime in her early years at the Habsburg court, and the effect, by all accounts, was immediate and total. Here was a writer who understood at the deepest level the experience of being out of place, of being too sharp, too honest, too much oneself for the world one was obliged to inhabit. Heine was an outsider in Germany because of his Jewish heritage, his liberal politics, his refusal to soften his observations into something more palatably comfortable. He was brilliant and bitter and funny in the way that only people who have genuinely suffered tend to be funny, a wit sharpened on the grinding stone of real frustration. Sisi, who was an outsider in Vienna for her own set of reasons, recognized all of this instinctively. She wrote to her youngest daughter, Marie Valerie, in a letter that has been preserved, "Heine is always and everywhere with me. Every word, every letter that only appears in his name is a jewel. Not a favourite author, not an admired poet, a jewel, something precious enough to carry with you." She studied his life as well as his work. She had a private statue of Heine made and installed in a small temple in the garden of her palace on Corfu the Aquileian, which we will come to in a moment so that she could visit it alone when she wanted to think. When the palace was eventually sold to the German Kaiser Wilhelm II after her death, one of his first acts was to have the Heine statue removed, because Heine was Jewish, because Wilhelm II was that kind of person. The statue was shipped to France, where it eventually found a home in a garden in Toulon where it still stands. Sisi, who had commissioned it, would not have been remotely surprised by any of this. She called herself a Heine disciple. She wrote in his style the precise, ironic, formally careful verse that could carry tremendous emotional weight, while appearing on the surface elegantly controlled. She used Heine's techniques the way a musician uses a master's fingering exercises, not to imitate but to develop a voice of her own. And what a voice it turned out to be. The poems that came out of that strongbox in 1951, published eventually in 1984 and still available today, with proceeds going, per Sisi's original instructions, to refugees and persecuted peoples, are not what anyone expecting court poetry would have anticipated. They are direct, they are sometimes brutal, they are funny in a way that the official portraits of Sisi with their diamond stars and their perfect composure give absolutely no hint of. She wrote about the Habsburg court with the precision of someone who had spent decades inside it, studying it, and finding it fundamentally and irredeemably absurd. She described the rituals and the protocols with a satirical eye that would have made Heine himself nod in recognition. The curators who later organized an exhibition of her work at the Hermes Villa in Vienna used lines from her poetry as headers for each room, and one of them noted candidly that the poems were not nice, very harsh. That is exactly what she would have wanted to hear. She also wrote one of the most devastating political observations made by any member of the European royal family in the 19th century. At some point in her later years, she announced to the Viennese court casually, as if she were discussing the weather, that she'd been told the most appropriate form of government was a republic. The silence that followed this remark was, one imagines, considerable. Now, the Aquileian. There are many things in Sisi's life that serve as a kind of symbol for the whole moments or choices or objects that, if you look at them long enough, begin to illuminate something essential about who she was. The Achillean is one of them. In 1892, years after the motorcycle of grief that had claimed her father and several other people close to her in rapid succession, and 1 year after the single worst event of her life, which we'll come to, Sisi had a palace built on the island of Corfu on a hillside above the Ionian Sea, surrounded by cypress trees and terraced gardens that fell away toward the water. She named it the Achillean, after Achilles. This needs a moment of unpacking because Sisi's relationship with Achilles was genuinely fascinatingly strange, and strange in a way that tells you something important about how she thought. Achilles, for those who need a brief reminder, is the great warrior hero of Homer's Iliad, the mightiest fighter of the Greek forces at Troy, known for his physical perfection, his absolute courage, his consuming pride, and the particular tragic quality of his existence. He was given the choice, according to myth, between a long, unremarkable life and a short, brilliant one that would make him immortal. He chose the short one. He chose glory over time. He walked into the battle that he knew would end him. Sisi's private writing about Achilles is not that of a classicist studying an ancient hero. It is something closer to recognition. She writes about him as if he is someone she knows, someone who understood as she understood the cost of refusing to diminish yourself into what the world requires. She commissioned a monumental garden statue of the dying Achilles for the Achillean's grounds, a figure of extraordinary painful beauty brought low by the one vulnerability he could not outrun. The sculptor was Ernst Herter. The work is still there, still standing in those terraced gardens above the sea, and visitors to Corfu can still look up at it and wonder, as Sisi must have, about the bargains we make with fate and the prices we pay for them. She also had a triumphant fresco painted inside the palace, the triumph of Achilles that showed him in his full glory before the end. Two faces of the same man, the victor and the fallen, the invincible and the vulnerable. I do not think this was accidental. I do not think anything Sisi chose for the Achillean was accidental. Have you ever built yourself a room, physical or metaphorical, that was entirely your own, a space that nobody else could enter without your permission, that contained only the things that mattered to you, that reflected back a version of yourself that the rest of your life rarely allowed to surface? That is what the Achillean was. It was Sisi's private mythology made physical. Heine in his garden temple, Achilles on his plinth. The sea which she loved with something beyond ordinary affection, loved in a way that recurs throughout her writing as a metaphor for the freedom she spent her whole life reaching toward. She described her time at Corfu in terms she rarely used about anywhere else. She could think there. She could be herself there. The island, the palace, the particular quality of the Ionian light she found in all of it, something that the Habsburg had never given her and never would. She wrote at Corfu, pages and pages of verse, some of it her finest. She studied ancient Greek not as a parlour accomplishment, but seriously and deeply working through Homer in the original language, sitting in her rooms, above the sea with a dictionary and a tutor, and the slow, patient pleasure of a mind that genuinely loved the work. Her Greek tutor during her later years, a young man named Konstantin Christomanos, left behind a memoir of his time with her, a portrait of a woman who, in the privacy of her own palace, was brilliantly alive in ways the public world never saw. Sharp, funny, intellectually restless, reading everything, thinking constantly. The Empress. He wrote, seemed always to be elsewhere even when she was present. She watched the world as if from a great distance with eyes that had seen too much of it, the poetry itself. I want to spend a little time here because I think it is one of the most under-examined parts of Sisi's story, the part that complicates the simple narrative of tragic beauty that adds a dimension of genuine intellectual seriousness to a woman who is too often reduced to her appearance and her losses. One of the recurring themes in her verse is the idea of predestination of certain connections that feel fated, as if the soul moves through history along a particular track drawn to specific people and places by some force that precedes ordinary logic. This is where the Heine connection becomes in Sisi's private writing genuinely strange and beautiful. She wrote as if Heine, who had been dead for decades, was somehow still present in her life, as if she were in conversation with him. The relationship she described was not supernatural in any crude sense, but rather a kind of spiritual kinship across time, a sense that she had been waiting without knowing it, to find his words, and that finding them had been the closest thing to being understood she'd ever experienced. "Heine is always with me," she wrote. "Every word he wrote speaks what I have felt and could not say. There is something in that, something about the experience of finding a piece of writing that articulates what you have carried alone for years, something that makes you feel less strange, less singular in your strangeness, that I think a great many people will recognize. Most of us have had that experience with at least one book, one poem, one song. For Sisi, that experience was with Heine's complete works read and reread across decades, a constant companion in a life that was, by her own account, fundamentally and achingly lonely. And then there were the poems she wrote about her marriage. These are the ones that the Swiss government in 1951 was most reluctant to publish. They are not cruel. They are not hateful. Franz Joseph does not come across as a villain. What they are instead is honest in a way that the public presentation of the imperial marriage had never permitted. They describe a relationship between two people who are fundamentally, perhaps irreparably mismatched in their understanding of what a life was for a man who found meaning in duty structure and the daily performance of his responsibilities as ruler, and a woman who found meaning in movement in thought, in the private territories of the self that duty never reaches. There is one poem written in London in April of 1888 that has been translated as a gentle wry address to Franz Joseph, in which she describes the empire as a cart stuck in the mud, the emperor as a man who has harnessed the wrong animal to pull it and herself as a noble horse standing in a nearby pasture that he has consistently chosen not to use. The image is playful. The point underneath it is not. Franz Joseph, reading it, if he'd ever been permitted to read it, would have recognized exactly what she was saying. He was, by the testimony of everyone who knew him well, a man of immense personal integrity and genuine devotion to his wife. He loved Sisi in his way completely and for his entire life. The tragedy between them was not that one was wrong and one was right. It was that their particular definitions of love were almost perfectly incompatible. He showed love through presence, through continuity, through the daily commitment of being there. She experienced love as understanding, and understanding in the end was the one thing he could never quite give her. She wrote about this too, directly, without self-pity, with the particular clarity that comes from having thought something through for a very long time. One poem from those locked volumes has stayed with me since I first read it, translated into English by biographer Brigitte Hamann. She wrote of a soul that had been given the whole world as a gift, all of it open, all of it available, and had nonetheless found that none of it was quite the thing she was looking for. "The whole world was open to me," she wrote. "I deceived and was deceived. I deceived and was deceived." That line lands differently depending on how you read it, whether you hear it as accusation or as confession or as something in between. The ambiguity, I think, is deliberate. She was too good a writer to leave it otherwise. There is one more thing about the poems that I find worth telling you, because I think it says more about who Sisi really was than almost anything else in her story. When she gave instructions for what to do with the strongbox and its contents after the 60-year period had passed, She was specific about one thing. Any money earned from the publication of her poetry was to go to political prisoners and their families in need, not to the Habsburg family, not to her own estate, not to any institution that had anything to do with the empire or the court, to people who were suffering because they had spoken freely in a world that punished free speech. She had never been able to speak freely herself, not fully, not publicly, not in any way that the institution around her could not contain or manage. But she had watched, she had understood the cost of it, and she had left in the only form available to her a posthumous act of solidarity with everyone who had paid that cost more directly than she had. The proceeds from her poetry collection still go as of this writing to the United Nations Refugee Agency, a 19th century empress writing in exile on a Greek island, leaving a legacy that pays for the protection of refugees in the 21st century. There is something in that story that defeats easy summarization, something that resists being folded neatly into any single interpretation of who Sisi was or what her life meant. She was complicated. She was genuinely complicated in the way that very intelligent and very unhappy people tend to be. Her private self, the Heine reader, the satirical poet, the builder of Achilles' temples above the Ionian Sea, was so different from the official image that the two barely seem to belong to the same biography. But that is precisely what makes her interesting. The diamond stars and the white silk gown, the corset and the gymnastic rings and the Hungarian language and the secret strongbox in Switzerland. The woman who told the Viennese court that republics might be the most appropriate form of government and then went home to a palace to write poems about it that no one was allowed to read for 60 years. She contained all of it. She chose to be all of it. And the world for the most part only ever saw the part she allowed it to see. What came next, the years that followed all of this, would test every part of her that had been forged in those decades of quiet, private resistance. Because grief, when it comes for you, does not ask whether you are ready. It does not check whether your armour is in place. And what arrived for Sisi in the final decade of her life was grief of a magnitude that even she, who had already lost so much, was not prepared for. It started on a January morning in 1889 at a hunting lodge called Mayerling, with a discovery so shocking that the Habsburg court did not know for days what to tell the world. That is where we are headed next. August 21st, 1858. Laxenburg Palace, just south of Vienna. The imperial couple's summer retreat, a place of lakes and wide gardens, far enough from the Hofburg to breathe differently. Sisi had laboured through a difficult night. The birth of Crown Prince Rudolf was hard, and her recovery would take weeks. But when they finally placed the infant in her arms, even briefly, even for a few hours, the news that swept through the empire felt almost like a kind of joy she had not allowed herself to feel before. A son, an heir, the one thing the Habsburg dynasty had been holding its breath for. Franz Joseph was so transported with pride that he pinned a colonel's medal to the baby's crib before the day was out. The infant was 24 hours old and already had a military rank. This, in retrospect, tells you everything you need to know about what Rudolf's life was going to look like, and about the battle his mother had already quietly decided to fight. I want to step back for a moment and think about what it meant to be Sisi's child. Not just Rudolf, all four of them. Because the story of Sisi as a mother is one of the most complicated and least comfortable parts of her biography, and I think it deserves more honest examination than it usually gets. The easy version of this story casts Sisi as a victim, a young woman whose children were torn from her by a controlling mother-in-law who was never given the chance to be a mother at all, and who therefore cannot be blamed for the distance that grew between her and her older children. There is truth in that version, real documented truth. Archduchess Sophie did take the children. The protocols were real, the constraints were real. We have covered some of that ground already. but Sisi was also by any honest accounting a complicated mother. She was sometimes absent when she did not have to be. She was warmer to some children than others, and her children felt that asymmetry acutely. She was capable of extraordinary devotion, and capable in the same life of a kind of emotional withdrawal that the people around her found painful and difficult to understand. She was not a villain in this story, but she was not simply a victim in it either. She was a person with her own damage, her own limitations, her own particular and sometimes imperfect way of loving, trying to navigate a role she had never been prepared for inside an institution that had been doing its best to break her from the day she arrived. Keep all of that in mind. Start with Gisela. Gisela Louise Marie was born on July 12, 1856, 14 months after her older sister Sophie, and into a court that received the news of a second daughter with undisguised disappointment. The empire needed sons. Girls were a diplomatic inconvenience at best. Archduchess Sophie, who had already claimed the first child, claimed Gisela too. Sisi barely had time to know her before she was moved to her grandmother's apartments, put on a schedule, assigned governesses, and integrated into the machinery of Habsburg education that had nothing to do with mothers at all. Gisela grew up by most accounts quite well, steady, practical, uncomplicated in her temperament, in a way that made the court considerably more comfortable with her than with her mother. She resembled her father, sober, dutiful, direct. She did not have Sisi's wildness, or her poetry, or her restlessness. She also did not have a close relationship with Sisi. Not ever, really. What she had instead was a quiet hurt that runs through the historical record in small moments. The times when Sisi was travelling and Gisela was at court. The times when Sisi's attention was concentrated entirely elsewhere. The way Gisela learned fairly early not to expect from her mother what other children might expect. There is a detail that the historian Brigitte Hamann notes carefully and without editorial comment in her biography. When Gisela was 16 years old, Sisi arranged her marriage to Prince Leopold of Bavaria without telling her daughter first, without asking, without a conversation. She sent the marriage notice via intermediaries. Gisela found out she was engaged through the court gossip system, rather than from her own mother. The irony of this, that Sisi, who had herself been married off at 16, in circumstances she had not entirely chosen, would arrange precisely the same fate for her daughter, in precisely the same way, is the kind of irony that resists easy interpretation. Was it thoughtlessness? Was it a failure of imagination, an inability to see her own experience reflected in her daughter's situation? Was it simply the weight of the institution reasserting itself through the person it had shaped, even against her own stated values? I do not know. I'm not sure anyone does. What we do know is that Gisela went to Bavaria and built a life there, a long, quiet, socially committed life that lasted until 1932, making her the last of the 4 children to survive. She set up a military hospital in her Munich palace during the First World War. She did charitable work throughout her life. She did not, by any available account, spend much time looking back toward Vienna. Then Rudolf Franz Karl Joseph Crown, Prince of Austria-Hungary, was born into a title before he was born into a life. Franz Joseph commissioned his military uniform before the infant could hold his own head up. The expectations were astronomical, the template rigid: a soldier, a statesman and emperor-in-waiting who would carry the Habsburg dynasty forward into the 20th century. The child who emerged into this role was the opposite of what the template required. Rudolf was sensitive, intellectually precocious, deeply curious about the natural world, particularly birds, which he studied with genuine scientific seriousness, and which eventually earned him an honorary doctorate from the University of Vienna. He was not robust. He was not built for the parade ground. He had his mother's restless intelligence, and it would become clear over time something of her darkness as well. Sisi had almost no say in the first years of his upbringing. Archduchess Sophie supervised his care. When he was 6 years old, Franz Joseph appointed a military tutor named Count Leopold Gondrecourt, a man whose approach to educating a sensitive child can be summarized without exaggeration as deliberate cruelty. Gondrecourt's methods were designed to harden the prince. In practice, they included waking the boy in the night by firing a pistol in his bedroom, locking him in game enclosures alone in the dark, long forced marches, cold baths, 13-hour days of drilling and physical training for a child who was constitutionally frail. By 1865, Rudolf was 7 years old, and by the accounts of people close to him in a state of psychological collapse. Nightmares, bedwetting, a fear of the dark that persisted for years. A child who'd been systematically frightened and exhausted, trapped in a role whose demands his father would not acknowledge as excessive. It was Count Joseph Latour, one of Gondrecourt's own officers, who had watched the situation with mounting alarm, who finally went to Sisi. And here is where something important happened. Something that tends to get overlooked in the broader narrative of Sisi's relationship with her children, but that I think deserves to be told properly. When Latour told Sisi what was happening to Rudolf, what had been happening in detail for over a year, she went to Franz Joseph. And she gave him an ultimatum. She told him either she would have absolute authority over the upbringing of her children, or she would leave the imperial court. Permanently. She had tried softer approaches before, letters, requests, gentle suggestions. The soft approaches had produced nothing. So she chose the hardest possible language, the only kind the institution had ever responded to. Franz Joseph, to his credit, heard her. Gondrecourt was dismissed. Count Latour was appointed in his place, a liberal, warm, intellectually engaged man who gave Rudolf a completely different kind of education. Science, languages, natural history, literature. A curriculum that met the child who was actually there rather than the one his father had imagined. Rudolf, given space to be himself, became extraordinary. He wrote, he published ornithological research, he corresponded with political thinkers, he developed liberal views that were in the context of the Habsburg court, almost radical views about constitutionalism, about nationalism, about the future of the empire that put him on a permanent collision course with his conservative father. He was in many ways Sisi's child more than Franz Joseph's, and the tragedy of it, the part that I cannot quite shake when I think about Rudolf, is that Sisi, having fought so hard to protect him when he was small, withdrew again when he was older. She was there for the battle. She was not consistently there for the aftermath. Rudolf grew up in the shadow of that absence alongside the presence she chose to give fully and without reservation to only one of her children. Have you ever witnessed or experienced the particular pain of a parent who loves differently depending on the child, not because they are cruel, not because they mean harm, but because something in them responds to one child in a way it simply cannot replicate with another? It is one of the most quietly devastating dynamics in family life, and it played out in the Habsburg palace with a specificity that everyone around the family could see and almost no one would say aloud. The child Sisi chose was Marie Valerie. Born on April 22, 1868 in Budapest, born in Hungary, the country that had given Sisi the closest thing she ever had to genuine freedom. Marie Valerie was everything that the previous decade of Sisi's experience of motherhood had never been. She was a child Sisi was allowed from the very beginning to keep. Archduchess Sophie, who had claimed every child before her was old and ill by 1868. Her grip on the nursery had loosened, and Sisi, who had waited 10 years for this, held onto this daughter with a completeness that was visible to everyone around her, and that the older children watching from a distance experienced as a kind of confirmation of what they had always suspected. Even Archduchess Sophie herself remarked in a letter to Sisi's mother that Sisi is completely absorbed by her love and care for this irresistible little angel. Coming from Sophie, who had spent years calling Sisi a silly young mother, this was something close to an admission. Sisi spoke to Marie Valerie exclusively in Hungarian. She brought her on her travels. She involved herself in every part of her upbringing with an intensity she had never been permitted, and perhaps by the time the older children had grown, no longer fully knew how to show the others. She called her the only one. Rudolf, who was old enough to understand what that phrase meant, was not entirely wrong to feel its sting. Marie Valerie's diary, which she kept throughout her life, and which is one of the most valuable primary sources we have for understanding Sisi in her later years, records a childhood of unusual closeness with her mother. The two of them read together, travelled together, argued about religion and politics with the kind of directness that Sisi showed very few people. Marie Valerie pushed back on her mother's ideas. Sisi responded by engaging rather than retreating. This was by all the evidence. The relationship Sisi had always wanted to have with a child. She also records with the honesty of someone who loved her mother deeply and saw her clearly the costs of that closeness. The intensity of Sisi's attachment when it came could be overwhelming. The love was real, but it carried the full weight of decades of longing. It was not always easy to be the one, and then there was the question Sisi asked herself in private toward the end of her life, a question that Marie Valerie recorded in her diary, and that sits with me still. When Rudolf was struggling, truly struggling in his marriage, in his health, in his darkening relationship with the empire he was supposed to inherit, Sisi was asked by her lady-in-waiting whether she intended to intervene, whether she planned to speak with her son, to involve herself, to try to help. Her answer, according to the historical record, was this: "Sometimes I've wondered what I could do, but I am reluctant to interfere, for I myself suffered so unspeakably under my mother-in-law that I do not wish to incur the reproach of a similar fault." She did not want to be Sophie, and in the effort not to be Sophie, not to control, not to interfere, not to impose herself on her adult child's life in ways that had cost her so much, she pulled back at the moment when pulling back was the wrong thing to do. It is one of the most painful ironies in her whole story. The wound that Archduchess Sophie had inflicted on her, the wound of a mother-in-law who controlled too much, expressed itself in Sisi as a mother who stepped away too far. The overcorrection of a person who was still in some fundamental way reacting to the damage done to her rather than acting from her own centre. She was not a bad mother, but she was a wounded one, and the wound shaped everything it touched. By the 1880s, Rudolf was in his 20s. He'd married Princess Stephanie of Belgium in 1881, a marriage that was unhappy from the beginning and grew worse as the years passed. He was intellectually brilliant and politically frustrated, a liberal crown prince in a conservative court, who could see with great clarity what was wrong with the empire and had no power to change any of it. He was increasingly reliant on morphine and alcohol, self-medicating a depression that the era had no real framework for treating, and a physical illness that those close to him were only beginning to understand the severity of. He wrote letters to Sisi during this period that are heartbreaking in their directness. He called her "my dear angel mamma." He told her things he could tell almost no one else, his fears about the future, his political frustrations, his despair at the gap between who he was and who the empire needed him to be. She wrote back. She tried. But the connection they might have had, the deep daily closeness that might have developed if she'd been allowed to raise him, if she'd not pulled back from his adult life for fear of repeating Sophie's mistakes, was not quite there. They loved each other with a real and genuine love, but they did not fully know each other. And by the time Rudolf was in his worst darkness, Sisi was travelling as she so often was, and the distance between them was not only geographical. On January 30th, 1889, a date we will return to shortly, Sisi would receive news about her son that would change her forever. But that is the next chapter of this story, and it is one that needs its own space. Because what happened at Mayerling was not only Rudolph's tragedy, it was also the moment that broke something in Sisi that had not broken before, not through loss, not through loneliness, not through all the years of controlled grief and private suffering. What Mayerling broke was whatever had remained quietly of her hope. And the story of what came next, the years she spent afterward, the woman she became, is in many ways more haunting than anything that came before. January the 26th, 1889. 4 days before everything changed. There was a family dinner at the Hofburg. A fairly ordinary evening by Habsburg standards, formal as everything in that palace was formal, but unremarkable. Rudolph was there. He was 30 years old. He looked to the people who saw him that evening a little withdrawn, quieter than usual. Perhaps, though, those who recalled it later admitted they had not thought much of it at the time. He had been withdrawn for months. He had been many things for months that the people around him had noticed, and then for various reasons decided not to address. 2 days after that dinner, Rudolph travelled to his hunting lodge at Mayerling, a small property he had purchased 3 years earlier, about 16 miles southwest of Vienna, tucked into the Vienna woods' private quiet, away from the court. On the morning of January 30th, his valet, a man named Loschek, went to wake him. There was no answer from behind the door. Loschek knocked, called out. Nothing. He went for help, found Count Hoyos, who had accompanied Rudolph on the trip. They tried the door together. It would not open. Finally, Loschek put his shoulder to a door panel, broke through just enough to reach inside and turn the handle from within. The room was shuttered and half dark. What they found there set in motion one of the greatest cover-ups in the history of the Habsburg dynasty, and broke quietly and permanently the woman who had spent 45 years trying to survive inside it. Before we go any further, I want to spend a moment with Rudolph himself, because he deserves more than a footnote in his mother's story. Rudolf Franz Karl Joseph was by any honest measure one of the most intellectually extraordinary figures the Habsburg dynasty produced. He had his mother's restless mind and his father's sense of duty, but neither parent's ability to carry the weight of those two things simultaneously without buckling under it. He published ornithological research. He corresponded with liberal thinkers across Europe. He co-authored a monumental geographical study of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that runs to 24 volumes and is still considered a significant work of 19th century scholarship. He could see the empire clearly, its fractures, its calcifying rigidity, the way it was failing to adapt to a world that had moved past it. He wrote about all of this in private letters and in anonymous political articles, with a clarity that his father would have found deeply uncomfortable had he known the full extent of it. And he could do absolutely nothing with any of that clarity. He was the crown prince. He was the heir. His role was defined before he was born, and the role had no space in it for a man who thought the way Rudolph thought. He had been unwell for years, physically, and in terms of his mental state both. His marriage to Princess Stephanie of Belgium was deeply unhappy. He was in chronic pain. He'd become increasingly dependent on morphine to manage that pain. His political frustrations had grown so acute that people close to him described a man who could barely see a future worth moving toward. He had in the weeks before January 30th written letters to several people, letters of farewell, including one to Sisi which she received and which apparently gave no indication of the specific plans he had made. Or perhaps the indication was there and she did not recognize it. That question has sat with historians for over a century without resolution. The news travelled from Mayerling to Vienna with the deliberate speed of a court that was not entirely sure what it was dealing with yet. The first messenger reached the Hofburg in the early afternoon of January 30th. Franz Joseph received the initial report, which at that stage was incomplete and confused. Rudolph had been found. There was something very wrong. The physician would know more. By the time the imperial physician Dr. Wiederhofer was summoned and had travelled to Mayerling and returned to Vienna, the situation was clearer. Horrifyingly, irreversibly clearer. Franz Joseph, still absorbing the initial news, sat down with Wiederhofer and asked him to speak plainly. Wiederhofer told him that Rudolf had not suffered, that death had been instantaneous, a bullet through the temple. What bullet? The emperor said. He genuinely did not understand. He had been told, or had told himself, that there had been some kind of accident, perhaps poison. Perhaps the young woman, Mary Vetsera, had done something terrible. He had constructed, in the few hours since learning of his son's death, a version of events in which Rudolf was a victim. Wiederhofer had to tell him the truth, that Rudolf had first taken Mary Vetsera's life, then remained with her body for several hours, then turned the weapon on himself. By the testimony of witnesses in the palace that day, what followed broke Franz Joseph completely. He wept, he stammered, he kept saying it was impossible, that his son had not done this, that there had to be another explanation. There was not. Now. Here is where Sisi enters the story in a way that has always struck me as one of the most extraordinary moments in the entire account of her life. The court faced an impossible task. Someone had to tell the Empress who had given birth to this child in 1858 while his father pinned medals to his crib, who had fought for his education, written to him as "my dear angel Mama," watched him grow into a man whose intelligence exceeded anything the empire around him could hold. Someone had to tell her. And the decision was made, whether by Franz Joseph himself or by those around him, is not entirely clear, that Sisi should be told first, before the news was made public, before the official announcement, before the story that the court would eventually release to the world that Rudolf had died of heart failure, a lie that would last precisely as long as it needed to, and no longer, before any of that machinery began to move. Sisi was told the truth. She received the news in her apartments. The accounts of what happened next are not many, and the ones that exist are carefully written by people who understood they were recording something that should be handled with care. But what we know is this: she absorbed it. She did not collapse. She did not in that first moment break apart in any way that the world could see. And then she went to Franz Joseph, because someone had to tell him to officially, personally, in the room where the emperor sat. That task fell to Sisi. She walked into her husband's study and told him that their son was dead. Not from heart failure, not from some accident or sudden illness, that their son had gone to Mayerling and had chosen not to come back, and that a 17-year-old girl named Mary Vetsera had gone with him into that choice. What it cost her to walk into that room and say those words, what it cost her to hold herself together long enough to do that, to be the one who told him to absorb her own grief and carry his simultaneously, that is something we cannot fully know. The historical record does not have access to what happened inside her in those moments. What we know is that she did it. The days that followed were consumed by the cover-up. The Habsburg dynasty was one of the oldest Catholic royal houses in Europe. A crown prince who had died by his own hand by the laws of the Catholic Church, he could not receive a proper burial. He could not lie in the imperial crypt with his ancestors. The scandal would be staggering. The political fallout would be severe. Franz Joseph worked with almost desperate speed to manage the situation. Physicians were asked to certify that Rudolf had been in a state of mental imbalance, a courtesy report, as historians have diplomatically called it. The Vatican was petitioned for a special dispensation, and eventually granted it. Rudolf would be buried in the Kaisergruft, the imperial crypt beneath the Capuchin church in Vienna, alongside 137 of his Habsburg ancestors. Mary Vetsera was a different problem. The 17-year-old baroness was already dead. The court could not acknowledge her presence at Mayerling without acknowledging what had actually happened there. So she was dressed, her body was dressed, and placed upright in a closed carriage, with a stick supporting her so that she would not fall and driven out of Meierling in the middle of the night. She was given a secret burial in the cemetery at a nearby village called Heiligenkreuz. No ceremony, no announcement. Her family was informed afterward. In 2015, letters that Vetsera had written in her final hours at Meierling farewell, letters to her mother and siblings, were found in a safe deposit box at a Vienna bank where they had apparently been placed in 1926 and never retrieved. The letters are heartbreaking and clear. They confirm that she knew what she was choosing. She wrote to her mother, "Forgive me for what I have done. I could not resist love." She was 17 years old. Meanwhile, Franz Joseph had Meierling, the hunting lodge where it all happened, demolished. In its place he built a Carmelite convent and endowed it with a chantry, so that nuns would pray daily in perpetuity for the repose of Rudolf's soul. Meierling today receives over 100,000 visitors every year. The altar of the convent chapel stands by some accounts precisely where Rudolf's bedroom was. The sisters of the silent order who live there are expected to welcome those visitors and to say nothing to them at all. Has there been a moment in your own life when you received news that didn't break you immediately, that you absorbed and held, and then felt the full weight of only later, when you were finally alone, when you had done what had to be done, and there was nothing left between you and it? That is what happened to Sisi in the weeks and months after Meierling. The public performance was managed. She appeared at the funeral. She stood where an empress was required to stand. She did what the institution asked of her in those terrible formal weeks. And then quietly she began to go. Not all at once, not dramatically. But something had shifted that would not shift back. She'd already lost her first daughter Sophie 32 years before that grief had been the first crack. She'd watched her marriage become something quieter and stranger than either she or Franz Joseph had wanted. She had carried for decades the private weight of her own restlessness, her own longing for a life that fit her better than the one she had been given. But Rudolf was the one who had called her "my dear angel mama." Rudolf was the child whose education she had fought for, whose tutor she had had replaced, whose liberal mind she had recognized as something of her own reflected back at her. Rudolf was the one who she had written privately carried something of her Bavarian blood, that particular quality she associated with her own nature, with her father, with the part of her that the Habsburg court had never quite managed to extinguish. She blamed herself. The historical record is clear on this. She blamed her blood, the Wittelsbach temperament, the darkness she had observed in her eccentric father, in her cousin King Ludwig II of Bavaria, who had died under mysterious circumstances just 3 years earlier in 1886. She told Marie Valerie Rudolf's bullet killed my faith, and she told her daughter something else, something that Marie Valerie recorded in her diary and that reads even now like a wound. She said she wondered if Rudolf had inherited something from her, something she could not name clearly, but which she associated with the quality of her own suffering, the restlessness, the darkness, the inability to fit inside the shape the world required. Whether that is accurate in any biological or psychological sense is something we cannot determine at this distance. What we can say is that it was what she believed, and she carried that belief for the rest of her life. After the public mourning period ended, Sisi stopped wearing colour. Black. Only black from that point forward. Occasionally in her very last years, a dress in some dark shade of grey or midnight blue would surface, a photograph here, a record there, but the general rule maintained for the 9 years between Rudolf's death and her own was black. She also stopped being seen. She had always travelled. She had always moved, always been somewhere other than Vienna, always kept the court at arm's length. But after Meierling, the movement became something different. less the restless but purposeful wandering of earlier decades, and more a kind of erasing. She began to disappear behind veils, behind fans, behind the fiction of travelling as the Countess of Hohenems. The pseudonym she adopted increasingly in her later years to move through the world without being recognised. She'd always hidden her face in later life. We talked about that refusal to be photographed after 32. But now the hiding had a different quality. It was less about controlling her image, and more about, I struggled to find the right word, removing herself, making herself progressively less present in a world she'd already found difficult to inhabit, and that now without Rudolf she found actively painful. She once said in these years that she was travelling the whole world over until I drown and am forgotten. Those are not the words of a woman who was at peace. There is one final thing about Mayerling that I want to tell you before we move forward, something that tends to get lost in the larger drama of the event. Rudolf, in his farewell note to Sisi, had made a request. A simple, specific request written in his own hand to his mother. He asked to be buried beside Mary Vetsera, not in Vienna, not in the imperial crypt, beside her in the village cemetery at Alland. It was of course impossible. The dynasty required him in the Kaisergruft. The church required the dispensation that only came with the official burial. The institution was not built for individual requests even from the dead. He was buried in the Kaisergruft, and Sisi, who knew what he had asked and knew it had not been granted, began to visit the Capuchin crypt privately alone sometimes in the very early morning before anyone else was about. Standing by his coffin, biographers have noted with careful restraint that she spoke to him there, that she asked him to make some kind of contact, some indication of his presence, because she needed to know whether he was at rest, whether whatever he had chosen had brought him the peace that his life had not. No such contact, as far as the historical record shows, was ever made. But she kept going back. In the 4 years between 1886 and 1892, Sisi lost her father, her beloved Andrassy Rudolf, her sister Helene, and her mother. 5 people in 4 years who had formed the emotional architecture of her inner life. By 1892, she was 54 years old. She'd been empress for 38 years. She had outlasted her mother-in-law. She had helped reshape the borders of an empire. She had written secret poetry that would not be read for 60 years. She had raised one child with her whole heart, and watched another choose a darkness she had not been able to reach him in time to change. And she had nothing left to hold her anywhere. What she had instead was movement. The last years of Sisi's life are in some ways the strangest and saddest of all. A woman in perpetual motion, across a continent travelling faster and more restlessly than ever, as if the sheer act of moving forward could outpace something that was in fact always right there with her. She was heading toward the lake in Geneva, and a stranger on the promenade and the last ordinary afternoon of her extraordinary life. But before we get there is something we have not yet talked about. The world that surrounded all of this, the growing age of restlessness and change and new political fury that was remaking Europe from the outside in, while Sisi's inner world was unravelling from the inside out. The story of how the wanderer finally ran out of places to run. That is what comes next. What does a 60-year-old empress look like when she is trying not to be found, not in a dramatic theatrical way, not with disguises and false beards, just quietly, persistently, with the practiced ease of someone who has spent years learning exactly how little it takes to become invisible, when you already have everything the world considers important? She wore plain dark clothes. She kept her veil down. She travelled under a name borrowed from a minor entry in the Habsburg court calendar, the Countess of Hohenems, and she moved through the great cities and sea roads of Europe, as if she was simply a well-dressed woman of private means, heading somewhere, always heading somewhere, never quite arriving. In the last decade of her life, Sisi was almost never where people expected her to be. She was always slightly ahead of her own itinerary, or slightly behind it, or in a city that no one had thought to look for her in. She had her own private railway sleeping car. It is still on display in Vienna at the Technical Museum, if you ever want to see it custom built for her needs, outfitted for long journeys, designed for someone who intended to spend a very great deal of time in motion. She once said something that I think is one of the most precise things she ever put into words. She said, "If I arrived at a place and knew that I could never leave it again, the whole stay would become hell despite being paradise. Not despite being a prison, despite being paradise." That is the distinction that matters. She was not running from something terrible. She was running from the impossibility of stillness itself. After Mayerling, the pace and character of her travel changed. In the earlier decades of her life, her journeys had a kind of direction to them. Madeira when she was unwell, Hungary when she needed to breathe, England for the fox hunting, Corfu for the Achillean. There was intention in the movement purposes, even if the purposes were private. After January 30th, 1889, the movement became something else. Less like heading towards something and more like a river that has lost the shape of its banks. She went to Morocco, she went to Algeria. She sailed through the Mediterranean in weather that alarmed her companions and didn't alarm her at all. She loved storms at sea with a fervour that the people around her found somewhere between baffling and terrifying. The rougher the water, the more alive she appeared. She went to Malta, to Turkey, to Egypt. She was one of the very few European royals of her era to visit these places at all. Most of her contemporaries regarded anything south of the Mediterranean as beyond the boundaries of appropriate imperial behaviour. Sisi apparently did not receive that particular memo, or if she did, she put it somewhere she couldn't find it again. She went to Terretet in Switzerland, to Cap Martin on the French Riviera, to San Remo, to Taormina in Sicily, where she stayed at what is now the Grand Hotel Timeo, then still a discreet destination for people who wanted to be quietly remarkable, without being observed. She went back to Corfu again and again long after she had grown ambivalent about the Achillean itself. She almost never stayed more than a few weeks anywhere, and she almost always travelled with fewer people than the court considered appropriate for an empress of her standing. The court, of course, had opinions about all of this. Vienna had opinions about most things, but particularly about an empress who seemed to treat her imperial title as something to be set aside when inconvenient like an overcoat. One doesn't want to carry on a warm day. The aristocracy murmured. Franz Joseph's ministers worried. The newspapers which tracked her movements with the obsessive dedication of a profession that had found its ideal subject speculated endlessly about where she was, what she was doing, what it meant. It meant she wanted to be left alone. That was genuinely the entire explanation. She had never wanted to be the subject of public attention. She had never wanted the scrutiny, the commentary, the endless measuring of her appearance and her behaviour against some ideal image that had been constructed around her without her consent. She had spent 40 years as one of the most visible women in Europe, and every year the visibility had cost her more than the year before. After Mayerling, she simply decided to minimise it as much as she possibly could. She refused in those final years to meet other European monarchs when she encountered them on her travels. Even when such meetings were diplomatically expected, even when the refusal caused delicate awkwardness, she sent her regrets and kept moving. Queen Victoria, whom Rudolph had once charmed during hunting trips to England, sent her condolences. Sisi accepted them and declined the meeting. She was not being rude. She was being honest about what she had left to give and how much of it she was willing to spend on ceremony. Have you ever been through a period where you just needed to not be yourself, or rather not be the self that everyone around you needed you to be, where you didn't want to explain anything or perform anything, or be present in the way that other people's expectations required? That is approximately what Sisi was trying to do in those years, though she was doing it on a rather grander geographic scale than most of us manage. The pseudonym she used, Countess of Hohenems, was not an invention. It was her 38th title in the official Habsburg court calendar, a real designation she was genuinely entitled to use. She simply used it instead of the others. She became the Countess, and the Countess could walk through a hotel lobby without the staff forming a reception line, could sit in a park without a cordon being established around her, could board a steamship with only her single lady-in-waiting beside her, and feel for a few hours like an ordinary traveller heading across an ordinary lake on an ordinary afternoon. The ordinary afternoon in the end was what she had always wanted most. Her last lady-in-waiting was a woman named Countess Irma Stare, Hungarian, naturally because the people Sisi kept closest in her final years were almost invariably Hungarian. Stare left behind a memoir of her time serving the Empress, and it is one of the more valuable portraits we have of Sisi in those last years because it was written by someone who was actually there. Stare describes the Empress she travelled with as, and this is interesting because it is not the portrait of a broken woman, which is what you might expect as a natural, liberal and modest character, a good listener, a keen observer, someone with a great intellect who found genuine pleasure in conversation in landscape, in the specific quality of light over water at a particular time of day. Not a woman who had given up. A woman who had, after considerable struggle and considerable loss, arrived at a kind of private peace that had very little to do with happiness in the ordinary sense, and very much to do with having stopped pretending. She did not pretend any more in those years, not to enjoy what she did not enjoy, not to be comfortable in company that made her uncomfortable, not to perform the role of Empress, in situations where the role felt like a costume rather than a truth. The Achillean, interestingly, followed this same arc. She had commissioned it in 1890, the year after Mayerling, the year she lost Andrassy, the year she was trying to build something out of the rubble of the worst period of her life. She had poured her private mythology into it, Heine in his garden temple, the dying Achilles on his great plinth, the triumph of Achilles in fresco on the walls, the terraced gardens stepping down toward the Ionian Sea. She'd imagined it as a refuge, and it was for a time. She went to Corfu repeatedly in the early 1890s, worked in the palace library, sat in the gardens, read Homer in the original Greek with her tutors, watched the sea from the terrace in the evenings. But she was Sisi. Stillness was not something she sustained. By the mid-1890s, the Achillean had become another place she left. She still returned to it. She went to Corfu again in 1897, and the accounts of that visit suggest she remained fond of the island itself, even as the palace had lost some of its power over her imagination. But the specific urgency of it, the feeling that it was the answer to something, had faded. She sold it shortly before her death, or rather the negotiations were still ongoing at the time of her death, and were completed by her estate. The buyer was Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, a man for whom Sisi had a very low opinion based on an impressively brief acquaintance. He paid 1 million gold marks for it. His first act of ownership, as we have already noted, was to remove the Heine statue from the garden. Sisi would have been completely unsurprised and entirely disgusted. The decade between Mayerling and Geneva was also in its quieter moments, a decade of unexpected warmth between Sisi and Franz Joseph. This is something that tends to get lost in the larger narrative, the image of the wandering empress and the dutiful emperor locked in their separate orbits, growing ever further apart. It is a compelling image, and not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. In those final years, something between them had softened. He was older. She was older. The political battles of the earlier decades were over. The long Cold War with Sophie was a generation past. Marie Valerie was grown and married and had given them grandchildren. The fierce, ongoing disagreement about what Sisi was supposed to be and what she refused to become, that argument had exhausted itself into something quieter. They wrote to each other, often and with the directness and tenderness that the letters of their middle years sometimes lacked. He worried about her safety when she travelled, specifically when she refused police protection, which she did consistently, and which drove him to quiet desperation because the political climate of the 1890s was not one in which it was safe for royals to wander unguarded. She dismissed his concerns. She told him she was the Countess of Hohenems, and nobody cared what happened to the Countess of Hohenems. She was wrong about that, as it turned out. But they wrote to each other. And when she was in Vienna, which grew rarer with every passing year but still happened, they spent time together with something that those who witnessed it described as genuine ease. Not the passionate devotion of their early marriage. Something quieter and perhaps in its own way more real. The ease of two people who have known each other for a very long time and have given up finally on the idea that the other person is going to become someone different. Marie Valerie noted in her diary that her parents' relationship had improved considerably in those last years, that the distance between them paradoxically seemed to have made room for something warmer than proximity had always managed. There is a detail from Sisi's final years that I find utterly characteristic, and that makes me feel every time I think of it a complicated mixture of fondness and sorrow. She used to walk. Not unusual for her, we've established by now that walking was simply part of how she moved through the world. But in her 60s the walks had become extraordinary. Multiple hours every day across landscapes that would have challenged people 30 years younger. Her companions, the ladies in waiting and tutors and occasional attendants who found themselves assigned to travel with her, would return from these walks having been essentially defeated by a woman of 60 who showed no signs of slowing down. There are accounts of attendants having to be collected by carriage sitting by the roadside exhausted waiting for relief while Sisi continued on ahead, without looking back. Her Greek tutor Konstantin Christomanos, who had served her in the early 1890s and whose memoir of those years is one of the most vivid accounts we have of her in this period, wrote about watching her move through landscapes with what he could only describe as a kind of determination that had nothing to do with a destination. She was not walking to get somewhere. She was walking because movement was the only state in which she felt fully reliably herself. She had always been like this. It had simply become in these last years the most concentrated and visible version of a quality she had possessed from the beginning. One thing she did in these final years that I find genuinely moving, and that speaks to something important about who she was underneath the legend, was the way she showed up in hospitals and charity wards, unannounced, with only one companion, in the plain dark clothes of the Countess of Hohenems. She had done this periodically throughout her life, visited ordinary people, sick people, people who were suffering in ways that her imperial existence should have insulated her from, but somehow hadn't. There is something in that impulse, in the willingness of a woman who had spent decades trying to disappear from public view, to keep reappearing in the most private and painful spaces of other people's lives, that I find genuinely difficult to explain away as performance. She'd always felt, by every account that survives, a particular kinship with people who were in pain they had not chosen. Perhaps because she felt she was one of them. Perhaps because stripped of the crown and the court and the myth that was the most honest thing she knew about herself. By the summer of 1898 she was 60 years old. She'd been Empress of Austria for 44 years, longer than any empress in Habsburg history. She had outlasted her mother-in-law, her son Andrassy, most of the people who had shaped her world. She had watched the empire she had been married into begin in small and then larger ways to show the strains of its own internal contradictions. She was in motion, as she always was. The summer of 1898 had taken her from Vienna to Munich, where she visited her brother Karl Theodor in July, and then through various stops along her usual routes. By early September, she was in Switzerland. She had been to a villa near Lake Geneva belonging to the Rothschild family where she had spent a few days as a guest. She was staying under her customary name at the Hotel Beau Rivage in Geneva. On the morning of September 10th, she planned to take a steamship across the lake to Montreux. Most of her small staff had already gone ahead by train. She walked to the landing with only Countess Stare beside her. It was a warm late summer morning. The lake was very still. The promenade was busy in the way that Geneva promenades are busy in September. Tourist residents, people heading to and from the water. She was not wearing a veil that morning. Someone at the hotel had recognized her. A Geneva newspaper had printed the information the day before the elegant woman travelling as the Countess of Hohenems was the Empress of Austria. And somewhere on that promenade a young Italian man named Luigi Lucchini had read the newspaper. What happened next in the space of a few seconds on the lakeside in the September light is one of the most strange and sad moments in the whole long story of Sisi's life, and it requires its own telling with the care it deserves. Because the way she died, the details of it, what she said and what she didn't say, what she understood and what she never quite grasped, is as extraordinary as any other thing she ever did. That is where we are going next. The last photograph ever taken of Sisi was captured 1 week before she died. It was taken at Terretet, a small resort town on the shores of Lake Geneva, and unlike the staged portraits and official images of her earlier life, the Winterhalter paintings, the carefully controlled photographs of her 30s, this one was apparently taken without her full knowledge. A photographer caught her on the promenade. She's wearing dark clothes, a veil partially raised, and she's walking. She's always walking. In the photograph, she looks like exactly what she had spent 30 years trying to become, a private person, in a public space, moving through the world on her own terms. She was 60 years old. She had 6 days left. Let me take you into the specific texture of those final September days, because I think they matter, not just as a prelude to what happened, but as a portrait of who she had become by then. Because the person who walked along that Geneva promenade on the morning of September 10th was not a tragic figure waiting for fate to arrive. She was a woman having, by most available accounts, a genuinely pleasant few days. She had travelled from Munich in July after visiting her brother Karl Theodor. She had moved through her usual autumn circuit, Switzerland, the French Riviera, the particular quality of September light over Alpine lakes that she had always loved. On September 9th, she had taken a paddle steamer across Lake Geneva to visit the Rothschild villa at Pregny, a social call, a day among people she found congenial, a good dinner. She had returned to the Hotel Beau Rivage in Geneva for the night, where she had stayed before and where the staff knew her preferences. That evening she had gone into the town with Countess Stare. They had visited a pastry shop. She had a particular fondness for a specific pastry shop in Geneva, and she bought things there for her grandchildren. Then they had returned to the hotel. She was, by the account of everyone who saw her that weekend, in reasonably good spirits. The morning of September 10th arrived warm and still, the kind of late summer morning that feels like a gift before the year turns. The plan was simple. The steamship Genève departed from the Quai du Mont Blanc at 1:35 in the afternoon, bound for Montreux. Most of her small travelling party had already gone ahead by train. She preferred to arrive at places separately from her own entourage, which was exactly the kind of arrangement that made her security officers quietly desperate. Only Countess Stare would accompany her to the boat. She did not want a procession. She never wanted a procession. Now, Luigi Lucchini. He deserves more than a footnote, because understanding him is essential to understanding why this particular day ended the way it did, and why the randomness of it is one of the most haunting things about Sisi's death. Luigi Lucchini was 25 years old in September of 1898. He had been born out of wedlock in Paris in 1873, abandoned by his mother raised in poverty, through a series of foster homes and orphanages, and had spent his adult life doing the kind of precarious, exhausting work available to men with no education, no connections, and no money, mason, railway labourer, valet. He had worked in various Swiss cities, living always at the margins, developing along the way a fierce and consuming political identity as an anarchist. Anarchism in the 1890s was not an abstract philosophy for men like Luciani. It was the ideology of people who had looked at the arrangement of the world, the staggering wealth at the top, the staggering poverty at the bottom, the gap between them growing every year as the industrial age accelerated, and had concluded that the whole structure needed to come apart before anything better could be built. Some anarchists wrote pamphlets, some organised workers. A small but significant number believed in what they called propaganda by deed, the idea that a dramatic political act, particularly one directed at a highly symbolic target, could do more for the cause than any number of words. Luciani had travelled to Geneva intending to carry out such an act. His original target was Prince Henri Philippe d'Orléans, the pretender to the French throne, a man of little actual political power but considerable symbolic value, as a representative of the monarchical order Luciani despised. But the prince had left Geneva before Luciani could reach him. He was standing in the city with nothing but his ideology, and a sharpened file. He had not been able to afford a proper weapon, and had sharpened a triangular metal file to a fine point and no target. And then a Geneva newspaper published on the morning of September 9th the information that the elegant woman staying at the Beau Rivage under the name Countess of Hohenems was the Empress of Austria-Hungary. Someone at the hotel had talked. Luciani read the newspaper. He later said, with the chilling simplicity of someone who had thought about this very carefully and arrived at a very clean conclusion, "I came to Geneva to kill a sovereign with the object of giving an example to those who suffer and those who do nothing to improve their social condition. It did not matter to me who the sovereign was whom I should kill. It did not matter to me who the sovereign was. That is the sentence that sits in my mind every time I think about September 10th, 1898. The randomness of it. The terrible structural randomness. Sisi was not targeted because of anything she had done or said or stood for. She was targeted because she was a sovereign and she was there. The woman who had spent 30 years trying not to be found was found by someone for whom the specific identity of his target was the least important detail. At 1:35 in the afternoon, Sisi and Countess Stare left the Hotel Beau Rivage and turned toward the Quai du Mont Blanc. It was roughly 100 yards from the hotel entrance to the steamship gangway. A short walk, an ordinary distance, the kind of distance you cover in 2 minutes without thinking about it, the kind that collapses to nothing in memory afterward. The promenade was busy in the way that Geneva is busy on a warm September afternoon. Tourists, residents, people heading toward the water or away from it. Sisi was wearing dark clothes. She'd been carrying her parasol. She was not veiled that morning. The September light was gentle enough, and she had perhaps let her guard down in the easy rhythm of those last pleasant days. Luciani had been watching the hotel. He had seen her leave. He approached them from the front, moving quickly with the intent focus of someone who has made a decision and is no longer deliberating. He appeared to stumble slightly, leaning forward as if to peer under the parasol, and in that motion so fast that neither woman fully registered it, he drove the sharpened file directly into her chest, just left of centre, a small precise wound barely visible. The file was thin and sharp enough that it passed between her ribs and through the pericardium, the membrane surrounding the heart, and into the heart itself before being withdrawn in the same motion. Sisi fell. The people nearby who saw her go down rushed to help. A coach driver reached her first. She was helped to her feet. She stood up. She thanked the people around her. She asked Countess Stare if they had time to make the boat. Think about that for a moment. She was already dying. The file had pierced her heart. What was keeping her alive in those minutes, what slowed the otherwise rapid sequence of events from wound to death, was a combination of factors that the autopsy the following day would document with clinical precision. The file was so thin and the wound so narrow that the internal bleeding was extremely slow. And her corset, that tight structured corset that she had worn every day for decades, the same garment that has been part of so much of her story, was pressing against the wound, slowing the external hemorrhaging to almost nothing. She felt pain, certainly. But she had felt pain before and walked through it. She had no reason to believe this was different from a punch, a stumble, a knock on the promenade. She walked to the gangway. Stare was holding her arm. The concierge of the hotel, an Austrian man named Planner, who'd been watching from the hotel entrance, had seen what happened and was alarmed. But Sisi was already heading toward the boat, and she moved with the automatic purpose of someone who has always kept going. She went up the gangway. She boarded the Genève. She sat down on deck. Stare still holding her arm, perhaps beginning to understand that something was wrong. Sisi's face had gone very pale, her breathing changed, tightened her grip. And then Sisi's eyes closed and she slipped sideways and lost consciousness. There was no doctor on the Genève. There was a passenger who had once trained as a nurse and came forward immediately. The captain of the ship, a Captain Roux, who had not known who his passenger was informed that a woman was seriously ill. He turned the ship around and returned to the dock. On that short return crossing, Sisi briefly regained consciousness. Stare was there, leaning over her. The nurse was there. Other passengers had gathered. Sisi looked up at the faces around her and said in German the last words she would ever speak. Was ist mit mir geschehen? What actually happened to me? Not I am dying. Not help me. Not even I am afraid. What happened to me? She was genuinely asking. In that brief, fragile window of consciousness, she did not know. She had walked from the hotel, she had fallen, she had been helped. She had boarded the boat, and now she was on her back on the deck of a returning steamship, with people leaning over her, and she could not account for the gap between one moment and the next. Then her eyes closed again. She did not open them. 6 sailors carried her back to the Beau Rivage on an improvised stretcher. She was taken to her suite room, 34 first floor. A physician, Dr. Gallet, arrived and was joined shortly after by Dr. Mayer. They worked on her for over an hour. At 2:10 in the afternoon, some accounts say 2:40, the precise time varying between sources, Empress Elisabeth of Austria, Queen of Hungary, Duchess of Bavaria, 60 years old, was declared dead. She had been empress for 44 years. The cause of death, as documented in the autopsy the following morning, was a wound to the pericardium and the heart itself. The file had penetrated 85 millimeters into her chest, fractured the 4th rib, passed through the lung, entered the heart from the top, and exited the base of the left ventricle. The hemorrhage into the pericardial sac, the slow internal bleed that the tight corset and the narrow wound had conspired to delay, had finally overwhelmed the heart's ability to function. She had lived for approximately 40 minutes after the attack. Lucchini, who had fled down a nearby street after the assault, had been caught by 2 cab drivers and a sailor who witnessed the attack and gave chase. A police officer secured him at the scene. When he was told in custody that the Empress had died, he was elated. He said, "I got her good. She must be dead." He considered it a political success. He was tried in Geneva, sentenced to life imprisonment, and spent the next 12 years in a Swiss cell writing a memoir about his life and his act. He was found dead in his cell in October 1910, having apparently taken his own life. The file he used to kill Sisi is on display today in the Sisi Museum inside the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. A small, ordinary-looking metal tool. The kind of thing you might find in a workshop forgotten in a drawer. Nothing about it, if you looked at it without knowing, would suggest that it ended the life of one of the most remarkable women in 19th century European history. Franz Joseph received the news at Schönbrunn Palace. He was 68 years old. He had been emperor for 50 years. He had managed over those decades to carry more than most people are asked to carry: revolution, military defeat, political humiliation, the loss of his son, the particular sustained sorrow of a marriage to a woman he loved deeply and could never quite reach. When the telegram arrived from Geneva, he sat for a long time without speaking. Then he said quietly, "So nothing is to be spared me in this world." I find that sentence almost unbearable every time I think of it. Not because it is dramatic, it is not, it is perfectly controlled, it is Franz Joseph to the last word. But because of what it reveals, a man who'd been waiting, perhaps without knowing it, for the next terrible thing. A man for whom the world had become a place that took things steadily and without explanation, and to whom the news of Sisi's death was somehow both a shock and in some dark corner of his understanding. Not entirely a surprise. He had worried about her travelling without protection. He had said so many times. She had dismissed his concerns many times. He wept, privately as he always did. Then he went back to work. Because he was Franz Joseph, and the empire did not pause, Sisi's body was returned to Vienna on a funeral train. It was placed in 3 coffins, 2 inner ones of lead, a third outer one of bronze. Franz Joseph's representatives travelled to Geneva to identify her, looking at her face through 2 small glass panels set into the inner lid. She lay in state at the Hofburg, where the Viennese public filed past in numbers so great that the lines stretched out into the streets and around blocks. The city was in genuine mourning, and not the performed mourning of official occasions, but something rawer and more confused, the grief of people who had watched this woman from a distance for 44 years and were only now confronted with how large a space she'd occupied in their imagination. On September the 17th, 1898, exactly 7 days after the attack, Elisabeth Amalie Eugenie was laid to rest in the Kaisergruft, the imperial crypt beside her husband's ancestors, beside Rudolf, whose request she had carried for 9 years and had never been able to honour. Franz Joseph would live for another 18 years. He died in November 1916 in the middle of the First World War, still emperor, still working, still doing what he had always done. He never remarried. He never, as far as the historical record shows, stopped thinking about her. Here is the question that I find impossible to avoid when I sit with the whole shape of Sisi's life and consider its ending. Was she afraid? Not in the abstract, not as a philosophical question about mortality, but on that specific promenade in those specific seconds before the file struck her. Did she see him coming? Did she have any sense, even a fragment of a second, of what was about to happen? Chataret's account, written afterward with the careful detail of a woman still trying to process what she had witnessed, suggests that the attack was too fast, that Lucheni moved with the terrible precision of someone who'd been waiting and had made himself ready, and that by the time either of them fully registered his approach, it was already over. The woman who'd refused a police escort because she was the Countess of Hohenems, and nobody cared what happened to the Countess of Hohenems, died not knowing what had happened to her. There is something in that, something I cannot quite decide whether to find merciful or unbearable, that feels like the last and strangest paradox of her whole life. She had spent 60 years trying to be invisible, trying to move through the world without being watched or seen or defined by anyone else's idea of who she was. She had almost succeeded. She'd gotten very close, and in the end she was found, not by someone who knew her name or her history or her poetry or her Hungary or any of the things that had made her who she was, but by someone who needed a sovereign, any sovereign, and picked her because she happened to be there. The most specific woman in the world reduced in her final moments to the most generic target. I do not have a comfortable way to end that thought. I'm not sure I should. What remained after her was the question of what she would become now that she was no longer there to resist it. Because Sisi had spent 30 years hiding from the public eye, refusing photographs, wearing veils, travelling as the Countess of Hohenems. She'd worked very hard to maintain the gap between who she actually was and what people saw when they looked at her, and the instant she was gone, that gap closed, and what rushed into the space she had carefully kept empty was something she would have found fascinating and infuriating in roughly equal measure. The myth-making began almost immediately, and what that myth became, and what it tells us about the way the world constructs the women it decides to love, is the final and perhaps the most interesting chapter of her story. The ink on the death certificate was barely dry. She had been dead for a matter of days, her body still travelling home on a funeral train through the Swiss and Austrian countryside, still in its bronze and lead coffins, still accompanied by the same courtiers who had served an institution she had spent 40 years quietly resisting, and the newspapers of Vienna were already rewriting her. The reports in those first September days of 1898 were extraordinary in their unanimity of tone. The monarchy's official publications led with the emperor. Poor Franz Joseph, they wrote, to whom fate had dealt yet another blow. The lonely devoted husband, the steadfast ruler. His grief was the organising frame through which Sisi's death was publicly processed. And then almost immediately something shifted, because the story of a beautiful empress tragically cut down in her prime was simply a better story than anything the monarchy had managed to produce in years. It was immediate, it was emotional, it was tailor-made for an era in which illustrated magazines and mass-market newspapers were reaching audiences that earlier generations of rulers could not have imagined. The tragedy of Sisi, the beautiful unhappy wandering. Mysterious Sisi was exactly what an audience trained on sentimental serials and romantic novels was primed to receive. Within weeks, commemorative images were being produced. Coins, postcards, porcelain plates, small statues, coffee tins. Her face, the face she had refused to allow photographed for 3 decades, was suddenly everywhere. She would have despised it. Let me tell you something about the specific portrait that became the dominant image of Sisi in death, because it is one of the great ironies of her story. The painting most associated with her, the image that appears on the Austrian souvenir chocolates, on the museum posters, on the coffee mugs in the gift shops and the magnets on 1,000 refrigerators across the world, is the Winterhalter portrait. Franz Xaver. Winterhalter painted it in 1865 when Sisi was 28 years old. White silk gown, diamond stars in her legendary dark hair, a quality of serene otherworldly beauty that the painter achieved by doing what great portraitists do, showing you the best version of what he saw lit and composed to obliterate anything complicated. Sisi did not entirely trust this portrait. She thought it was beautiful but felt it did not quite capture her. She was right. It did not capture her. It captured what other people wanted to see when they looked at her. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that I think she would have found both fascinating and absolutely infuriating, is that this image she was skeptical of became after her death the image that outlasted her. The image that was reproduced hundreds of millions of times. The image that the Viennese tourist industry is still built around nearly 130 years later. She had spent 30 years refusing to be photographed and then died, and the photograph she would have approved of least became the icon. The first film about her life was made in 1919, directed by Marie Lariche, who was extraordinarily Sisi's own niece, the same Countess Lariche who had facilitated the introduction between Rudolf and Mary Wetzera, and whose complicated role in that tragedy had not quite destroyed her publicly. It was a silent film, naturally, because it was 1919, and it set a template that would prove remarkably durable. The template was this: a young woman of great beauty and free spirit placed by love and fate into the glittering confines of an imperial court, navigating that tension with grace and occasional sadness. The dark chapters, the lost children, the body obsessions, the secret poetry, the hungry politics, the mailing catastrophe, the decades of wandering grief were present in outline but softened, abbreviated, given the warmth of dramatic sentiment rather than the cold specificity of historical fact. Then came the 1930s, which brought serialized novels, and then came Ernst Marischka. Ernst Marischka is the man most responsible for Sisi as the world knows her today, and I think this deserves a full moment of consideration, because the scale of what he created is genuinely staggering. Between 1955 and 1957, barely a decade after the Second World War, in an Austria still recalibrating its identity, amid the rubble of the empire and the more recent rubble of another conflict, Marischka made 3 films. The Sisi trilogy, starring a young Romy Schneider who was 16 years old when she auditioned, and whose luminous, warm, fully alive quality on screen was so perfectly suited to the role that she would spend the rest of her career in complicated ways trying to escape it. The films are beautiful, genuinely beautiful. Romy Schneider is extraordinary in them, full of the spontaneous, unguarded energy that made her a major star. Marischka gave the trilogy everything: sweeping mountain landscapes, lavish court interiors, romantic music, the particular golden light of Bavarian and Austrian summer that feels almost like a physical thing on screen, and they bear essentially no relationship to historical reality. Franz Josef in the Marischka films is a dashing romantic lead who falls helplessly in love with the perfect girl at first sight and remains devoted to her throughout a story of imperial bliss. There is no Sophie as a controlling adversary, or rather Sophie appears in a softened form, her edges rounded off into manageable unpleasantness, rather than anything more structurally damaging. The children are not taken, the loss is not present, the poetry does not exist. The body rituals are charming rather than compulsive. The political manoeuvring with Hungary is reduced to its most decorative elements. The Sisi of Marischka's films is a fairy tale. She's the girl who gets everything she wants and wears it beautifully, and the world absolutely loved her. The trilogy was the highest-grossing film series in German-language cinema history for decades. It was shown across Europe, translated, dubbed, distributed. It introduced the name, and note the name as Marischka spelled it, with a double S Sisi, to millions of people who had never heard of the real Elizabeth at all. It made Romy Schneider famous across the continent, and it created a problem that Austrian historians and serious biographers have been fighting ever since the problem of a cultural image so powerful and so affectionate that the actual person underneath it became genuinely difficult to see. Here is an interesting question worth sitting with. Why do we do this? Why does the world, and I include all of us in this, because it is not a question about anyone else, it is a question about human nature. Why do we take complicated people, particularly complicated women, and smooth them into something simpler and more comforting after they die? It is not a new impulse. It predates cinema by centuries. The historical record is full of women who were complex and difficult and inconvenient in life, and who became iconic and beloved in death, precisely because death removed the inconvenience. The real person, with all her contradictions and her private suffering and her refusals and her difficult edges, was replaced by a symbol that could be used for whatever purpose the era required. In Sisi's case, the purpose was remarkably specific. She died in 1898, just as the Habsburg Empire was beginning its long, slow decline toward the catastrophe of 1914. She died as Austrian identity was being contested and reshaped. And her image, beautiful, romantic, universally beloved, became available at exactly the right moment to serve as a unifying cultural symbol for a nation that needed one. The lonely, beautiful empress became the face of Habsburg nostalgia, not because it was accurate, but because it was useful. And once an image becomes that useful, it develops a kind of inertia that is nearly impossible to reverse. Romy Schneider herself is one of the most poignant chapters in the whole Sisi mythology. She played the role at 16-17, 18 3 films in 3 years, in the full bloom of a particular kind of youthful beauty that the camera loved and that audiences found almost painfully affecting. And then she tried to leave. In the early 1960s, Schneider moved to Paris. She began working with directors like Orson Welles and Luchino Visconti. She took on roles of genuine darkness and complexity. She worked hard over many years to establish herself as a serious dramatic actress rather than the Austrian sweetheart who'd played a fairy tale empress in Technicolor. She largely succeeded. Her later career, particularly in films like La Piscine and Ludwig, is considered by critics to be the work of a major dramatic talent. But she could never entirely leave Sisi behind. The role followed her. Interviewers brought it up for the rest of her life. German and Austrian television broadcast the trilogy every Christmas, and every Christmas the association was renewed. She died in 1982 at 43 under circumstances of great private grief. She'd lost her son David the year before in a terrible accident, and the tributes inevitably circled back to the role she had spent 20 years trying to transcend. There is something in Romy Schneider's relationship to the Sisi films, the woman trying to escape the image she'd been associated with in youth, trying to be taken seriously as herself, rather than as the symbol she had embodied, that has a certain uncomfortable rhyme with Sisi's own relationship to her public image. The empress who refused photographs, the actress who couldn't outrun a role. History occasionally has a very dry sense of humour. The musical Elizabeth is a different kind of phenomenon, and one that I think deserves attention, because it demonstrates something important about how the Sisi myth has evolved over time. Composed by Michael Kunze and Sylvester Levay, the musical premiered in Vienna in 1992 and has been running somewhere in the world almost continuously ever since. It has been translated into 11 languages, performed in over 40 countries, and seen by over 10 million people, making it one of the most successful musicals in the history of European theatre. The character at the centre of it is not quite Sisi as the Marischka films presented her, and not quite Sisi as the historians describe her. It is something new, a stylized, darkly romantic figure wrestling with death, as a literal character on stage searching for freedom and finding it in the end only in dying. The musical is not history, but it is interesting, because it does something that the earlier myth did not. It takes Sisi's darkness seriously. It acknowledges in its operatic theatrical way that this was a woman who suffered, who refused, who was somehow always in conversation with her own mortality. The figure of death as a seductive character who calls to Sisi throughout her life, who represents in the show's symbolic logic the only freedom fully available to her, is melodramatic in the way that musicals are melodramatic. But the underlying insight is not nothing. The show's longevity suggests that audiences are drawn to something in Sisi's story that the sugary Marischka version did not quite satisfy. That they want, or at least can absorb, a version that is a little more complicated, a little more honest about the cost of the life she led. Vienna today is saturated with Sisi. There is the Sisi Museum inside the Hofburg Palace, opened in 2004, occupying the imperial apartments, featuring over 300 original objects, including her travelling medicine chest, her gloves, her fans, her personal umbrellas, her first aid kit, and the original death certificate. The museum's stated intention is explicitly to dismantle the Marischka version, to replace the fairy tale with something closer to the actual person. The tour begins with her death, and works its way back through her life, deliberately reversing the conventional direction of biography, to place the ending first and force the viewer to understand what they are actually looking at before they begin. The curators are aware of the irony that this more honest, more critical Sisi museum has itself become a major commercial attraction. The Sisi ticket, a combined entry to the Sisi Museum, the Imperial Apartments and the Imperial Silver Collection, is one of the most popular tourist purchases in Vienna. Millions of people buy it every year. She would have hated that. And yet, and this is the complication that I keep returning to the fact that the more honest version of her story is the one drawing millions of people into a museum tells you something. It tells you that the audience has evolved, that people are interested in 2025, not just in the beautiful fairy tale, but in the person underneath it, in the poetry, in the contradictions, in the question of what it actually cost her to be the woman the world decided she was. The Netflix series The Empress, which launched in 2022, was the streaming platform's most watched non-English language title. In its first 2 weeks, streamed in over 23 million homes, accumulating nearly 135 million viewing hours. That is an extraordinary number for a historical drama about a 19th century Austrian empress. The show takes considerable dramatic license, as all dramatizations of her life do. But its existence and its extraordinary reach confirm something that the whole long arc of the Sisi myth suggests the story of a woman who refused to be contained by the role she was placed in, who fought for her own interior life against enormous institutional pressure, who wrote secret poetry and tattooed anchors on her shoulder, and walked until her ladies-in-waiting had to be rescued from the roadside. That story keeps finding new audiences, because something in it keeps being relevant. The question worth asking, the one I find most interesting, and the one I want to leave you with before we step into the final chapter of this story, is a simple one. What do we actually see when we look at Sisi Not the Chocolates? Not the Romy Schneider films? Not the Winterhalter painting? When we look at the actual historical record, the real woman, the poetry, the strongbox in Switzerland, the Hungarian, that nobody asked her to learn the anchor tattoo, the parallel bars in her private apartments at the Hofburg, the question she asked on the deck of a steamship in September 1898, what do we see? I think we see a person who was in many of the most important ways trying to do something that most of us recognize from our own lives in a smaller key. Trying to be herself, trying to maintain some essential private core that the world around her wanted to reshape into something more convenient. Trying to hold on to the right to be complicated, to be private, to be more than the image other people projected onto her. She did not entirely succeed. None of us do in the end, but she tried, and she left evidence of the trying in a locked box with instructions sealed until the world she knew was safely over. That feels to me like the most human thing about her. And the most human thing about her is the thing that the myth, for all its beauty and its reach and its 10 million musical tickets and its 135 million streaming hours, keeps trying to get close to. It keeps failing. It keeps trying anyway, just like she did. There is one final piece of this story we've not yet told, the piece that brings everything together. What Sisi actually wanted. What she would have said if she could speak directly to a world that has been constructing and reconstructing her image for over a century. What her life taken as a whole teaches us. Not the myth, not the museum, not the musical. The actual woman as close as we can get to her across the distance of time. That is where we are going next. Let me tell you about a painting. In the mid-1880s, Sisi commissioned a portrait of an actress from the Burg Theatre in Vienna. She arranged the sitting herself, chose the painter herself, and then sent the finished work as a gift to her husband. The actress's name was Katharina Schratt. The gift was not accidental, it was not impulsive, and it was not in the way that the word is sometimes used with a slightly arched eyebrow, generous in a complicated or suspicious way. It was by every account of the people involved and by everything we know about how Sisi thought, and what she needed an act of considerable clarity. She was giving her husband a companion, deliberately, openly, with her full blessing and her active encouragement. And this arrangement, this strange, carefully constructed triangle of an aging emperor, his perpetually absent wife, and a warm, pragmatic, gambling-addicted Viennese actress, is one of the most genuinely unusual love stories in the history of the Habsburg dynasty, which, given the competition, is saying something. To understand the Katharina-Schratt arrangement, you have to understand what had become of Sisi's marriage by the 1880s. Franz Joseph and Elizabeth had not led a conventional married life for decades. The emotional and physical distance between them had grown progressively through the 1860s and 1870s until by the time of the Austro-Hungarian Compromise, the period of Sisi's greatest political influence, which we've already covered, they were functioning more as close affectionate correspondents than as husband and wife in any conventional sense. They wrote to each other, regularly, warmly, with real feeling. He addressed her as his dearest angel. She called him her dear, dear one. The letters are genuinely touching, not the letters of two people who dislike each other, but of two people who love each other and have understood that love does not require proximity, and that perhaps in their particular case it was better expressed at a distance. There was also the harder truth, which Sisi appears to have processed more honestly than most people do with difficult information. Franz Joseph had not been faithful. This had become clear to Sisi as early as 1860, the occasion of her first extended departure to Madeira, which her physicians attributed publicly to a chest complaint, but which historians have since established was connected to an illness she had contracted from Franz Joseph. The discovery of his infidelity in this most direct and unwelcome of ways had shaped everything that came after. There is a quote attributed to Sisi in a conversation with her daughter, Marie Valerie, that cuts to the heart of it with characteristic bluntness. Marriage is a nonsensical institution. One is sold off as a 15-year-old child, taking an oath that one does not understand, cannot revoke, and then regrets for 30 years or more. 30 years or more. She was speaking from experience. She was not wrong. And yet, and this is the part that I find most genuinely interesting about Sisi, she did not hate Franz Joseph. She did not, after the initial fracture and the long period of recalibration, treat him with contempt or bitterness. She wrote to him. She confided in him in certain things. She found over the decades a genuine warmth for the man who had chosen her at 15, and then built a world around her that she could not inhabit. She simply stopped pretending that the marriage was something it had ceased to be, and when she found that he needed something, she could not give him presents, companionship, the daily warmth of another person, in a life that was otherwise very alone, she went looking for it on his behalf. Katharina Schratt was born in Baden by Wien in 1853, the daughter of a stationery dealer with a passion for theatre from the age of 6 that her parents had tried, completely unsuccessfully, to suppress. By the time she joined the ensemble at the Burg Theatre in Vienna, in 1883, she was already one of Austria's most celebrated stage actresses, known for her warmth, her comic timing, and a quality of human accessibility that audiences found irresistible. She was also by 1885 separated from her husband, a Hungarian baron named Nicholas Kiss von Itterby, and raising her son Anton largely on her own. She loved gambling, was not good at managing money, and maintained what her Wikipedia entry might decorously call a wide circle of male acquaintances. She was in short a real person, with flaws and appetites and a very clear-eyed understanding of how the world worked for women in her position. The first meeting between Katharina and Franz Joseph that anyone noted with significance was at the Ball of the Industrialists in 1885. Sisi had engineered the invitation. She had heard that the Emperor had been attending Katharina's performances at the Burg Theatre with particular interest, and she saw an opportunity. What followed was one of the more extraordinary social maneuvers in Viennese court history, because it happened entirely in the open. Sisi not only approved of the developing relationship between her husband and Katharina Schratt, she actively facilitated it. She wrote to Katharina herself. She arranged meetings. She adjusted schedules and extended invitations with the cheerful efficiency of someone who has decided that a thing needs to be done and is going to do it properly. Franz Joseph, for his part, was initially bewildered by the extent of his wife's enthusiasm for the arrangement. He wrote to Sisi with something approaching mild alarm that he was not sure he understood what exactly was being offered. She clarified with characteristic directness that she simply wanted him to have a friend, someone warm and uncomplicated, someone who would be there. He accepted. And here is where it gets interesting, because the relationship between Franz Joseph and Katharina Schratt was genuinely one of the more touching in his long life. He visited her in the mornings, often walking from Schönbrunn to her villa on the Gloriettergasse, which he had bought for her at an hour that would have surprised his courtiers if they had known about it, which they inevitably did. He brought her flowers. He wrote her letters of extraordinary emotional openness, the kind of letters he almost never wrote to anyone, because Franz Joseph was a man of profound self-containment, whose inner life was conducted largely in private. To Katharina he was different. She made him laugh. She talked to him about theatre, about gossip, about the small textures of ordinary life that the palace systematically removed from his experience. She was not awed by him. She was not performing for him. She was simply there, in the uncomplicated, daily, reliable way that Sisi never managed to be. The nature of the relationship, whether it was ever physical or whether it remained throughout, as Katharina herself insisted in her later years, an emotional intimacy rather than anything more, is something historians have debated without ever arriving at consensus. What Katharina said when asked directly in her old age was beautifully deflecting. "I am an actress, not a writer, and I have nothing to say, for I was never a Pompadour, still less a Maintenon." Those two names, the Marquise de Pompadour and the Marquise de Maintenon, were the famous official mistresses of French kings. By distinguishing herself from them, she was saying, "I was not that. Whatever I was not an official royal mistress in the historical sense." The distinction, if you look at it carefully, leaves considerable room. He left her 500,000 gulden in his will, a sum that dwarfed her annual theatrical salary of 8,000 gulden by a factor of over 60. He bought her a house near Schönbrunn and another in Bad Ischl. He paid her gambling debts more than once without apparent resentment. When she died in 1940 at the age of 86, she was visiting the tombs of Franz Joseph and Sisi at the Kaisergruft every single day. I find that detail almost unbearably human. An old woman long after empires had fallen and a world war had come and gone, walking to a crypt every morning to sit with the people she had loved. Now, while all of this was being carefully arranged in Vienna, Sisi herself was having an experience of her own that illuminates something important about what she was actually looking for. In 1874, she travelled to England for the first time as an adult, ostensibly for the hunting, which was genuinely excellent in the English and Irish countryside, and which offered the kind of riding that even Godurlo and the Hungarian plains could not quite match. And there she encountered Captain William George Middleton. Bay Middleton, he went by Bay, a reference to his reddish-brown hair, and the colouring of the horse he favoured, was 30 years old in 1876, when he was formally asked to serve as Sisi's pilot during the hunts at Lord Spencer's estate. The job of pilot was specific to ride just ahead of an honoured guest on a difficult course, selecting the line, reading the terrain, ensuring that the follower could navigate the most demanding jumps and obstacles with guidance rather than alone. It required complete trust on both sides. Middleton was by contemporary accounts one of the finest horsemen in England, elegant and daring, with the particular confidence of someone who was genuinely never afraid of offence. He was described as an amusing daredevil and very good company. He was also a bachelor, and he was from the moment Sisi began riding alongside him, someone in whose company she was visibly uncomplicatedly alive. They rode together across the English countryside and then the Irish countryside for years, following hunts through conditions that challenged experienced riders, and that Sisi took on with the fearlessness she always brought to a horse. He would select the line. She would follow close, trusting him completely. It was an unusual kind of intimacy available through a very specific physical language, entirely acceptable in the public context of a hunt. British and Irish society noticed the pair. Of course they did. There was inevitable gossip Middleton was handsome unmarried and spending long days in close physical proximity to one of the most famously beautiful women in Europe. Sisi's own sister, Marie-Sophie, in a moment of considerable tactlessness, relayed to Rudolph the things British society was apparently saying about his mother. Sisi was deeply hurt. The sisters never fully recovered from that particular wound. As for Middleton himself, what he actually felt about Sisi beyond the particular professional pride of a horseman in service of an extraordinary horsewoman is not something the historical record preserves in any detail. He married Charlotte Baird in 1882. He died in 1892 at 45, thrown from his horse in a steeplechase. When Sisi heard of his death, he had visited her at Goderloh as recently as 1888. She was reportedly quiet for a long time. She did not comment publicly. She very rarely did on the things that mattered most. Have you ever had a person in your life who didn't necessarily fit any of the conventional categories? Not quite a friend, not quite something more, just someone in whose presence you felt most like yourself, someone who called up a version of you that the rest of your life didn't quite reach. I think Bay Middleton was something like that for Sisi. Not a romance in the conventional sense, not Andrassi's political and intellectual partnership, not anything that resembled the complicated dynamic with Franz Joseph. Something more elemental, the feeling of being genuinely matched, of riding beside someone and trusting them completely, of being seen in motion rather than in stillness. The horses were always for Sisi the most honest thing. The triangle of Franz Joseph, Katharina Schratt and Sisi persisted in its unusual way for the rest of Sisi's life. And in the later years, the years after Mayerling, after Andrassy, after the period of wandering grief we have already described, it settled into something that all three of them seemed to have understood and accepted. Sisi was away, Katharina was there. Franz Joseph wrote to both women in different registers about different things. Katharina held his daily emotional life together. Sisi held something else, the deeper, stranger connection, the one that he expressed when she died as, "You have no idea how much I love this woman." Not loved, how much I loved. Present tense shifted into past only by the force of the grammar. He never quite stopped, and Sisi, who had made this arrangement, who had commissioned the portrait and arranged the ball invitation, and been genuinely pragmatically pleased, when Franz Joseph found comfort in Katharina's company, seems to have understood something that we rarely think about when we construct our narratives of love and marriage. That love is not a finite resource, that it does not divide by the number of people who receive it, leaving less for each, that a husband finding warmth elsewhere does not necessarily diminish what remains between a husband and wife, not when what remains between them has already become something quieter and stranger and more durable than passion. She wrote to Katharina in one of the more remarkable documents in this story, "I am so infinitely glad that you are fond of the Emperor, so infinitely glad." The woman who had organized the arrangement was genuinely grateful that it was working, grateful that her husband was not alone, grateful that someone was there. That is not the emotion of a woman who felt replaced. It is the emotion of a woman who had thought very clearly about what love requires and what she was and was not able to provide, and had acted accordingly. What does all of this tell us? I have been sitting with this question for a while, and I want to be honest, I do not think it tells us something simple or comfortable. Sisi's approach to her marriage, the radical pragmatism of it, the willingness to step back from conventional expectations and arrange things as they actually needed to be, rather than as they were supposed to be, was not without cost. It cost her a great deal in the ordinary sense, the closeness, the daily life, the ordinary domestic texture that most of us consider fundamental to a marriage. She and Franz Joseph never lived together in any meaningful way after the 1860s, but she also seems to have arrived eventually at something that functioned. A relationship that survived not because it pretended to be what it had ceased to be, but because both people inside it were honest in their different ways, with different levels of articulateness about what it actually was. He loved her. She knew. She was grateful. She loved him in her way. He knew. He never entirely recovered from losing her. And between them, in the space they had made for her, Katharina Schratt walked every morning to the Kaisergruft for the last years of her long life, and sat with whatever she needed to sit with, and then walked home. There is one more thing I want to say before we step into the final chapter of this story, the last thing, the thing that brings everything together. We have spent a great deal of time with Sisi from the outside, her history, her decisions, her relationships, the myth that surrounded her, and the reality that she tried to maintain underneath it. We have followed her from the meadows of Possenhofen to the promenade in Geneva, through everything in between. But there is a question that this whole story has been building toward, a question that Sisi herself asked explicitly in various forms throughout her life, and that her life taken as a whole answers in a way that I find genuinely worth sitting with. The question is not about what happened to her. It is about what she actually wanted, and whether in the end she found any of it. That is the last thing we need to talk about. Sometime in the late 1880s, Sisi sat down and wrote a few lines that she never showed to anyone. She wrote about a bird, not a wild soaring creature, not the eagle or the hawk that one might expect from an empress who spent her life chasing open sky. The bird she wrote about was a small one, ordinary, trapped inside a room, beating its wings against the glass of a window that looked out onto something it could see but could not reach. She wrote, "Like a bird that beats against the glass, I search for something I do not know what. I know only that I have not found it. I do not know what. I know only that I have not found it. After everything we have travelled through together, the Bavarian meadows and the Hofburg protocols and the Hungarian poetry, and the Achilles statue above the sea and the locked strongbox in Switzerland and the promenade in Geneva, after all of it, this is the line that stays with me most, because it is so honest, and honesty for Sisi was always the most radical thing. What did Sisi really want? The easy answer. The answer that the souvenir shops and the Marischka films and the romantic novels tend to offer is freedom. She wanted freedom. She was the free spirit trapped in a gilded cage, and what she wanted was to fly. That is not wrong. But I think it is incomplete, because freedom for Sisi was never just about movement. She was one of the most well-travelled people of her era. She went to Morocco, Algeria, Malta, Egypt, Turkey, Greece, England, Ireland, Portugal, France, and spent more time at sea than most sailors. If freedom was simply a matter of geography, she had it. More of it than almost anyone else in Europe. And yet she wrote at the end of her life that she had not found the thing she was looking for. So it was not just movement, not just the absence of walls. Let me offer you a different reading of what Sisi actually wanted, one that I think is supported by the whole arc of her life, rather than any single part of it. She wanted to be seen, not in the public way, not admired, not photographed, not worshipped by crowds who lined the streets as her carriage passed. She had all of that and found it intolerable. She spent 30 years hiding from exactly that kind of seeing. What she wanted was to be seen from the inside, to have someone or some world or some version of herself in the world that could hold all of it at once. The wild Bavarian girl and the empress who helped reshape the Habsburg map of Europe. The poet who wrote dark satirical verse about the court that surrounded her, and the woman who wore diamond stars in her hair for the Winterhalter portrait. The mother who fought for Rudolph's education, and the mother who pulled back at the wrong moment. The person who loved Heine and tattooed anchors on her shoulder at 51, and learned Greek in her 60s and built a palace for Achilles above the Ionian Sea. She was all of these things simultaneously, and the world kept insisting on choosing one. The court chose the empress, the Hungarians chose the queen, the mythmakers chose the beautiful young woman frozen at 28. Franz Joseph chose perhaps the woman he had fallen in love with at Bad Ischl, and spent 40 years hoping she would return to him. Even the people who loved her most tended to love a version of her, a part, a facet, the complete picture, the full, complicated, contradictory, brilliant, damaged, deeply alive person. That was what the strongbox was for. That was what the 60-year delay was about. That was why the poems were sealed. She was preserving for people she would never meet the version of herself that the world around her could not quite absorb. Now here is a thought I find genuinely striking, and I want to share it with you as we come to the end of this story. Sisi died in 1898. The poems were opened in 1951. The definitive biography Brigitte Hamann's The Reluctant Empress was published in German in 1981, translated into English, and became the scholarly foundation for a serious reckoning with who Sisi actually was. The Sisi Museum, which explicitly sets out to dismantle the Marischka myth and show the real woman, opened in 2004. The Netflix series The Empress, which for all its dramatic license takes Sisi's inner life seriously as a subject, reached 23 million homes in 2022. In other words, the world's ability to see Sisi more clearly has been improving steadily decade by decade since her death. She predicted this. Remember what she wrote to the souls of the future. Sealed in that strongbox, she hoped they would be more open than her own time, more capable of understanding a woman who could not be contained by a single role, more willing to sit with contradiction rather than resolve it into something simpler. She was writing to us, literally, to people sitting in the 21st century, with all its own imperfections and its own ways of misunderstanding people who do not fit the expected shape. And the question worth asking, the one I want to leave you with, is whether we have actually become what she hoped for. I think the honest answer is sometimes, in some ways. More than before, but not entirely. We're much better now at recognizing the kind of structural pressure that Sisi was living under, the way institutions and expectations and inherited roles can shape a person's life before they have any say in it. We have better language for it. We recognize more readily the cost of being asked to be everything to everyone while remaining nothing specific to yourself. But we're still, as a culture, in love with the simplified version. The souvenir chocolates still outsell the biography. The Marischka trilogy still gets rebroadcast every Christmas. The image that dominates popular culture is still the Winterhalter portrait, a 28-year-old woman frozen beautiful and silent. She would find this frustrating and also, I suspect, not entirely surprising. She understood with the particular lucidity of someone who watched how the world constructed her image from very close range, that the gap between a person's interior truth and the version of them that history preserves is almost always enormous, that the myth is easier to carry than the person. That beauty once attached to a name tends to outlast everything more complicated. What she did not entirely expect, what I think would genuinely move her if she could see it, is how many people have kept reaching past the myth anyway. How many biographers and historians and scholars have spent careers trying to get closer to the actual woman. How many visitors to the Sisi Museum in Vienna have stood in front of her private gymnastics equipment and her handwritten poetry and her 63-piece travelling medical kit and thought, wait, she was more than I knew. How many people are watching a YouTube video about her right now in the dark and finding themselves surprised by how recognisable she is? Because that is the other thing about Sisi. Underneath all the history, underneath the dynasty and the politics and the tragedy and the myth, she is recognisable. The girl who wanted to be left beautifully alone. The woman who could not quite fit inside the role she had been handed. The person who built an interior world so rich that it survived sealed in a box for 60 years. The human being who loved a few people very deeply and felt the loss of them for the rest of her life. That is not unusual. That is a person. And persons, when they are honest enough, when they have the courage to be themselves, even in secret, even in ways that only reach the world decades after they are gone, have a way of making other people feel less alone. There is a small street in Geneva between the Mont Blanc Bridge and the crossing to the Rue des Alpes, where a bronze plaque is set into the railing above the lake. It marks the spot. Tourists pass it every day, most of them not knowing what they are walking by, some of them stopping, some of them taking photographs, some of them reading the words and standing for a moment before moving on. The lake is still there. The September light still falls across it in the particular way it does at that latitude in that season. The steamships, different ones now, but the same route, the same water still cross between Geneva and Montreux. In Budapest, the Elizabeth Bridge still spans the Danube between Buda and Pest. Statues of her stand in squares and parks in Hungary, placed there not by government decree but by a people who decided on their own, and over generations that she was worth remembering. In Corfu, the Aquileian Palace is a museum now. The terraced gardens above the sea are open to the public. The statue of the dying Achilles still stands on its plinth, not the one she commissioned, which was replaced by Kaiser Wilhelm II, but a later version, still there, still looking out toward the same horizon she once looked at from the same hillside. In Vienna, the Sisi Museum receives millions of visitors every year. Franz Joseph's representatives bought her coffee tins and souvenir magnets at the gift shop. And in a room deeper inside the museum, behind the commercial surface of the myth, her private poems are on display, translated, reproduced, offered to anyone who wants to read them. The woman who sealed them for 60 years is now read by strangers every day. She would have feelings about that. Complicated ones. Here is what I believe, having spent a great deal of time with her story. Sisi did not find what she was looking for. Not entirely. Not in the way the bird in her poem found the open sky. But she came closer than the myth suggests. She found Hungary, and Hungary found her, and that finding was real and mutual and lasting in a way that outlived the empire and the monarchy in her own life. She found poetry a private language for the parts of her experience that no other language could hold, and she preserved it with enough care that it is still being read a century and a quarter after she sealed it away. She found in the end a kind of peace with the specific shape of her own life, not contentment exactly, not happiness in the ordinary sense, but something that her Greek tutor Konstantin Christomanos recognized when he wrote that she was a natural, liberal and modest character who watched the world as if from a great distance with eyes that had seen too much of it. The distance was real, but so was the watching. She never stopped watching. She never stopped being curious. She learned Greek in her 60s. She fenced in her 50s. She tattooed an anchor on her shoulder at 51, and then walked into a sailor's parlour like she owned the place, which as the Empress of Austria she technically could have. That to me is the truest version of Sisi. Not the girl in the winter halter portrait, not the tragic wanderer in black, not the symbol on the souvenir tin. A woman who kept growing right up to the edge of the afternoon. She walked down to the Geneva promenade to catch a boat. still curious, still moving, still herself. And here at the end of this long journey is what I think she teaches us. Not a lesson you can reduce to a quote for a coffee mug. Something more useful than that. She teaches us that the life we're placed into, the family, the role, the expectations, the institution is the material we're given to work with. Not the life itself, the material. And what we make of it in the margins and the private hours and the sealed strong boxes and the language we choose to learn against anyone's advice is ours. She teaches us that love is complicated and that complicated love is still love. That a marriage can become a friendship and a friendship can become something more durable than passion, and that none of it requires pretending. She teaches us that grief does not resolve. It becomes part of the architecture of a life. Little Sophie and Rudolph and Andrassy and all the people she lost, she carried them. Visibly in the black she wore for 9 years, invisibly in the poems she sealed away. Neither weight ever fully left her. She carried them anyway. And she teaches us perhaps most importantly, most quietly, that being fully yourself is not a destination. It is a practice. Something you return to over and over against the constant pressure of a world that would prefer you simpler. She practiced it her whole life, not perfectly, not without cost, but with a persistence that I find honestly extraordinary. We've travelled a long way together tonight, from a Christmas Eve in Munich in 1837 and a little girl born into a family where freedom was the only real inheritance that mattered, to a September afternoon in Geneva in 1898, and a woman who asked with genuine puzzlement what had just happened to her, and in between everything we have covered together, the Hofburg and the gymnasium, the Hungarian poetry and the locked strongbox, the palace above the Ionian Sea and the anchor on her left shoulder, the son she lost and the daughter she loved and the husband who said when she was gone that no one would ever understand how much he had loved her. I hope you feel by now that you know her a little. The real her, not the chocolate tin, not the 3-film trilogy, not the image on the magnet. The woman who wrote in a poem sealed for the souls of the future, I know only that I have not found it, and who kept looking anyway. That I think is enough. That might actually be everything. Thank you for spending this night with me and with Sisi. Genuinely thank you. These are the kinds of stories I stay up late thinking about, the lives that refuse to be simple, the people who are complicated in exactly the right ways. Sharing them with you is the reason I do this. If something in tonight's story stayed with you, a detail, a moment, a line of poetry, I would love to know which one. Leave it in the comments. Tell me what surprised you. Tell me what you already knew and what you did not. Tell me where in the world you are right now and what the light looks like outside your window. And if you have not already hit that like button, subscribe if you want to stay in this particular corner of history with me. Every time you do it genuinely helps this story reach someone else who might need it. Because there is always another story waiting. A life just as complicated as Sisi's, just as full of things the world got wrong and things that deserve to be said properly. The next one is already taking shape, and I promise you it will be worth staying up for. Sleep well. And remember, even the most extraordinary lives are underneath everything, just people trying to find the thing they are looking for and keeping going, even when they have not found it yet. That is very human. That is us. Good night.